Hanji, good. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. First of all, congratulations to Experience Sikhi, Sikh Youth Federation. I guess which Experience Sikhi is what I'm supposed to say now, as of 3 minutes ago. Okay. Congratulations. That we've been watching out from Vancouver the seva that you've all been doing. It's really quite incredible. Two other Guru Sikhs joined me on this trip. Paneet Singh and Gurjot Singh, we were just up last night talking just about kind of like our admiration that you've managed to get such a breadth of programming and of service out of one organization and one and managed to bring so many people, different people together under one banner. That's really quite impressive. And so yeah, just really congratulations, and I hope Maharaj blesses you to keep doing this seva in the future. I wasn't sure, because is this the first Sikhia talk? Okay, it's the first one. So trying to gauge what the vibe is, right? It's should I do a mangal before I start? I don't know. And then you guys started clapping, so I'm saying no on that one. But that's cool. We'll just kind of figure it out as we go along. We've got a pretty flexible time limit, it looks like. So the way that I think would be best to proceed for myself would be that if we can totally have a conversation. I'd love to have conversation, but just for the sake of clarity, if there's questions or comments or input, if we could save that for the end, and then we'll just do a dedicated question answer sharing period. For myself, this history is near and dear to my heart, and by virtue of that, it's very much about community. It's very much about storytelling. It's very much about sharing. Just yesterday, I met some Guru Sikhs from here who are related to one of the first Granthis from Millside Gurdwara, or the Gurdwara that used to be at Fraser Mills, which is like a 10-minute drive from my house, which is really quite inspiring to hear how their migration history panned out, how that affected the spirituality in their home, their religious practice, their community practice. So I would love to have that kind of moment of sharing at the end. But yeah, if we could do that at the end, that would be fantastic. So Sikh revolutionaries in Canada. I should pick this up. This is what we click with, yes? And this is okay, good. Sikh revolutionaries in Canada. And let's start here. I do want to acknowledge first that we're gathered on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is our honor and privilege to be on this place where we can live, work, play, share, storytell, engage in spiritual practice, live and love. So very much a heartfelt thank you to those peoples whose land we're situated on. In Vancouver generally, I don't know how it is here yet. Last time I was here was Sikh Heritage Month in 2017, so it was a couple of years ago. And land acknowledgement was kind of just starting to become a thing of practice. I think it was a little bit harder. This time it seems like there's more resources available. In Vancouver, pretty much before we start any event, we generally do an Indigenous land acknowledgement. I consider it very important for a good practice for us as Sikhs, as people who are benefiting from a system of privilege, or benefiting from the system of settlement under which people have been oppressed for generations on this land, to at the very least acknowledge that on this territory that we stand on, especially when we're talking about this subject in particular, early Sikh revolutionaries in Canada, early Sikhs of the 20th century, because I want to share something with you that it's really super Vancouver based. And so the title of the talk is Sikh Revolutionaries in Canada. I know this should really be titled like Sikh Revolutionaries in BC. I'm sorry, there's not a lot of people in Toronto back then, right? It was cold, I don't know. It's cold now, this is ridiculous. Why is it snowing? Anyway, we're very much West Coast people. We're not used to snow. But it's very much important for this talk. And so there's a word that exists in the Punjabi language. It only exists in Vancouver for Indigenous peoples of Canada. I don't know, do people know about this? The word is taike, right? Taika meaning cousin, right? So your taika would be your cousin who is the child of your dad's elder, of your taya, your dad's elder brother. So early on in Vancouver, where there was a lot of intercultural history, it wasn't just people didn't exist in silos because of the level of racism, discrimination, and oppression. There was a lot of intercultural communication support that crossed over between indigenous communities, East Asian, such as Chinese and Japanese and South Asian communities. So that kind of familial bond was made. So this word taika was established. So when they talked about indigenous people, they would say taike. And if you look at the word, it's really quite beautiful. The word, because if you look at the relationship, is that if you're thinking about your thais, the kids of your thaya, that's someone who you, in India, you'd probably be sharing a living space with, right? And some of us might now too, is that a lot of the times is that like brothers are living together with their parents, and then they have their kids, and their kids who are cousins live together. But if you are born into a house, and your father has an older brother who's your taya's children have been there before you were there, right? So you're acknowledging that you're coming into this place where these people already were. So it's a really beautiful term. And then there's that kind of familial bond of cousin, right? My dad, I can tell you, he used to do a lot of work on reserves back in the 90s, electrical work. And even in the 90s, when a lot of the indigenous folks that lived on the reserve, they would go up to him and they'd be like, "How's it going, cousin?" And they would call him cousin, which is really cool. Unfortunately, there's a not so great history with the word taike. A lot of people don't know the history of the word because from like the last few decades, it hasn't been used as a term of endearment. It's been reappropriated and been made into an insult, into a slur. It's kind of like how the word gyani is used in Surrey. I don't know if you know about that. I don't know if it's the same here, right? Like gyani or GGB, if that's a thing. It's not. It's kind of funny, but it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. But it was a term of reverence and honorific, a term of respect, but it was reappropriated basically into a slur, right? Into racialized language. So then taike kind of became like an insult. You'd usually probably say some choice words in a taika after. But the word itself comes from a very beautiful place. And I think in this time of truth and reconciliation, as we call it, it's a great time to reclaim that word to what it originally meant. And in that vein, what's up? in that vein, I want to share with you a quote from one of these early South Asian Gadarites in Vancouver. And this is something that because very quickly they identified with the indigenous community. And so this was something, and we don't know who the source is. We just know that this was the quote that was written down. It's, "This country belonged formerly to the Canadians." They're using the word Canadian here to mean indigenous. So this country belonged formerly to the Canadians, but the English conquered it 400 years ago. The original inhabitants now are not allowed to walk in the streets, and they go about the country like wandering tribes. They do not possess an inch of land, but subsist by fishing on the sea. In our country, there is no sea. What shall we do? So it's this beautiful kind of kind of finding commonality with that. There's a struggle happening that's just starting to kind of foment in Punjab, right? The Gadar Revolution, which is just starting very early stages in the early 20th century. And they kind of identified this common oppressor, right? The colonial power, the English. So they've come now. Usually a lot of the people that were coming from Punjab were ex-military people. They were ex-British Indian soldiers that had benefited from the British Raj, right? That they were oppressed, but they had kind of maneuvered in a way where they weren't kind of like the most oppressed people in that empire. It's a tricky part of our history that I kind of just glossed over there. I'll get into it more a little bit later. But it's this very beautiful moment of there's people who've conquered our land over here. We've come over here. We see that they've done the same to you, and then there's that kind of that establishment of that relationship. So just wanted to start there. I think it's really important that as we look into our history here at this place, where we weren't the ones who settled this land, we were not the ones who established these colonial systems, but we are ones who benefit from it, right? We have our own racial and discriminatory issues. We have our own issues of like that was involving migration. We've had our own struggles, both siloed and intercultural, but at the same time, we really have to honor whose land it is that we're standing on. So from there, let's get started. Historical context. We're starting in about there's a really famous story of how Sikhs first came to Canada, and this is really kind of neatly packaged. We're not 100% sure if it's true, but it's pretty like accurate. It's like kind of a microcosm of what could have been true. The story is in 1897, Queen Victoria was doing her one of her jubilees, so an anniversary of how long she'd been the monarch. And so she was going all around the empire, and they're having big parades, and yay, Queen Victoria, yay, yay, yay. And so she ended up in Vancouver, where one of the regiments, I believe it was the Hong Kong Regiment of the British Indian Army, accompanied her as her bodyguards, in which there were Sikh military officers. They came to Vancouver and they saw, hands up, who's been to Vancouver before? Good. So you realize how much better it is. No, I'm just kidding. We're all very, I'm just kidding. But many of us have been to Vancouver. If you have, and you've been to downtown, and if you've been to Cost Vancouver, like actual city of Vancouver, Vancouver used to be tiny. It was only downtown Vancouver and up to 12th Avenue, which is literally 12 blocks. That's how big the city of Vancouver used to be. Everything outside of that used to be South Vancouver, which was its own city. And a lot of that was agricultural, and all the cities beyond that were agricultural. So these military people who have come from Punjab now, and they see Vancouver and all this opportunity, and they realize that, hey, we're British subjects, they're British subjects, it's free movement across the empire, we can just come and move here, and we can make some money and go back. And that's when migration started. That's kind of the neatly packaged story that we've all understood. When migration picked up, early 1900s, 1904-ish is when we start to see lots of South Asians, it was mostly Punjabi, but there was like people from India of all kinds that are starting to come on by ship, right? From 1904 until about 1906, there's estimated to be about 5,000 people who have arrived, mostly situated in the city of Vancouver and the surrounding municipalities. So, what was Vancouver like back then? As a historical context. So much racism. That's it. That's all I can tell you. There is so much racism. It is incredible. Let me show you, actually. This is a newspaper. This is what they've written. The Hindu invasion. Okay, straight up. So the word Hindu was used as a catch-all term for Indian. This is what they used to say, is everyone was a Hindu. Okay, and it's funny because if you see this, it says the Hindu invasion, a new immigration problem, and the caption says a group of Sikhs. So it was very much a misnomer, and it was just used. It was used as racialized language. Often it would be spelled with 2 O's, but anyone who came from India was called a Hindu. Okay, so you'd hear the Hindu problem, the Hindu invasion. This was regular stuff that you would see on the front page of the local newspapers, of national newspapers everywhere. This particular one, this is the only picture that I don't have sourced. I think it's Maclean's magazine. If it's not, it might be a magazine from down the west coast of the United States. But very much that time period, very much what's going on all around. Tons of racism. Like, I can't even tell you, like, obviously, like, day-to-day racism, like, people running down the street and, like, shouting stuff at you, obviously. But then it goes into labor. It goes into labor because most people worked at sawmills back then. Sawmills where you cut down trees, treat the wood, all that stuff. And a lot of the Sikhs ended up working at sawmills. A lot of the South Asians worked at sawmills. A lot of the Chinese, Japanese community did as well. The Chinese community very famously was a lot of the labor that was used on making the CPR, the railway. So some South Asians were involved in that as well. But a lot of the times, the reason that a lot of migrant communities were used to build the Canadian Pacific Railway across Canada was because it was the most ridiculous working conditions you'd ever imagine. They would be building trains, they'd be building a railroad track through the Rocky Mountains. And what do you have to do? Just throw dynamite and blow the mountain up. So many people died. So many people were injured. So many people were paid unfairly, obviously. And in sawmills, it's very simple. Like, usually if you're a white worker, you're making between $1.50, $2 a day. If you were a South Asian, if you were a migrant worker, you're making between 25 and 50 cents. So that's the kind of situation that you have in 1906. Come 1908, that's when the government puts its foot down because the government kind of there was a bit of an economic, and this is where it's going to be really technical for like 5 minutes, then I promise it'll get more interesting. In 1908, we have a bit of a recession going on, not a lot of jobs going around. And who's the first person the government blames when there's no jobs? Immigrants, yes. Like everyone said it together. Immigrants, yes. Immigrants are the first people that the government likes to blame, and that's what they do. And so as soon as you vilify the immigrants, right, whether they're Chinese, whether they're Japanese, whether they're South Asian, it's very easy for people to jump on board. And then it's very easy for people to rally around that thing. And this is coming top down. It's coming on the, like from the city of Vancouver, it's coming from the province of BC, it's coming more than anything else from the federal government. Anyone here gone to, hands up if you went to Laurier, the school. Laurier? Hey, you sure? You want to cheer about that? Okay. Let me tell you a little something about Laurier. So a few racist regulations were passed by the government. One was called the Chinese head tax, very famously. It was straight up, if you were Chinese and you were coming to Canada, you had to pay a tax of $50 because of who you were. That's it. You come from anywhere else, that's fine. If you come from China, you have to pay $50. Simple. Then, to cut off immigration from India, they had to do something a little bit more strategic, because you have to consider, even though Canada was a dominion by this time, or this after Confederation, there's still this identity with the British Empire. Before World War I, Canada was very much still part of like that British Empire machine. So you couldn't be straight up just like the same as like, you're from India, we don't like you. That wasn't possible. There had to be a little bit more tricky maneuvering happening. So they passed this law called the Continuous Journey Regulation. Continuous Journey Regulation was pretty simple. What it meant was, if you wanted to immigrate to Canada, you had to come on a non-stop journey from your country of origin to the port in Canada which you intended to arrive at. Okay? So that meant that if you were coming from Ireland, it had to be a ship coming straight from Ireland and docking in Canada, wherever you meant to dock. If you were coming from India, you had to come straight from India without any stops. Problem was, back in that time, no company made that. It was like trying to buy a plane ticket that doesn't exist, right? No one did that. It was that simple. No one did a direct passage from India to Canada. It was near impossible. People didn't think like you can go from Asia to Canada without stopping. It was just simply too far. And so with that, they effectively cut off immigration. They're like, you can't do that anymore. When people still were kind of finding ways to get in, sometimes basically like one-offs, they added another rule, which was you had to pay $200. You didn't have to pay. You had to have $200 on your person, Canadian, to get into the country. So let's say somehow you jumped on a ship from India and you got here magically, even though that's not possible. But let's say you did, but then you got here. Now to get into the country, you have to show me that you have $200 Canadian. Bearing in mind, you're coming from India, bearing in mind that if you're working on a sawmill in Canada, you're making about 25 cents to 50 cents per day. So if you worked on a sawmill for every day for, testing my math, 400 days straight and didn't spend a cent, then you would have enough money to get into Canada in the first place. But you couldn't be making that much money because you're not in Canada. But that doesn't really matter because there's no ship that's going to bring you anyway. Okay? So we essentially established that if you're from India, you cannot come anymore. Now, Laurier people, let me talk to you for a second. Laurier, this is documented. If you look at the Hansards, it's like you can look to what's been said in the parliament over the years. It's all archived. And you can look this up. Laurier the Continuous Journey Regulation, when it was being passed, Laurier was our beloved prime minister, noted for being one of our most progressive prime ministers of the time, very revolutionary. This is what he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but I'm paraphrasing close enough. What he said was, because it came up like, okay, well, let's say there's a German living in Australia, and this German person living in Australia comes and wants to come into Canada. And they're like, well, this is Laurier's response. He's like, I hope they would exercise enough common sense to let that person in. And he said, the way I understand it, the reason that the Continuous Journey Regulation is in place is to keep people that are physically and morally unfit from entering the country. Who went to Laurier? You want to cheer one more time? But that's Canada's one of their most like iconic turn of the 20th century, most progressive prime minister of this time. I think Globe and Mail or National Post wrote an article about him like a couple of years ago, talking about how like amazing he was. That was Laurier. Anyway, everybody's racist. That is Canada at the time. Essentially, everybody is racist. Okay, and this is on every level now. I think we've established that, from legislation to labor to on a social level. Another big piece of legislation that was really important was even when immigration was happening, South Asian women were not allowed into the country. It's as simple as that. If you're a woman, you couldn't come. The reason was because that once women came, they were afraid that the roots of the family would be set down, right? Very much like textbook gender norm kind of prescribing that this is what will happen. That right now they're thinking that, okay, if a bunch of people come from India, then they will leave eventually because they'll make money, their families are back in India, and then they'll make a bunch of money and they'll go back. But if the women come and they start having children here, then they'll lay down roots here. And if they lay down roots here, they'll never leave. So it was simple as that. Women couldn't come. So when we're talking about these 5,000 like South Asian people, predominantly Punjabi, they're all men, more or less. There might have been 1 or 2 women back then, and we'll get into that. That's the world we're living in 1906. Okay, so in 1906, I do like again. I don't know what kind of talk this was going to be, so we're trying to figure it out. I did root a lot of what we're going to be exploring through Gurbani. That's what I like to do. And there's a shabd the Maharaj writes, "Than suhava pavitra hai jithe sant sabha." Embellished and immaculate is that place where the saints gather together. And in that vein, in 1906, the Sikhs, S-I-K-H-S, gathered together and established the Khalsa Diwan Society. And the Khalsa Diwan Society was an organization to represent the political, spiritual, religious, and social interests of the entire South Asian community. Focused, rooted in the Sikh community because the community was predominantly Punjabi Sikh then, but it was for everyone back then. So in that vein, January 19th, 1908, the first ever Gurdwara Sahib in Vancouver is opened. Khalsa Diwan Society Vancouver, also known as 2nd Avenue Gurdwara. If you've been to Vancouver, this is on 2nd Avenue. This is just when you cross Burrard Bridge into Kitsilano. If you know Kitsilano now, Kitsilano's famous for things like Bard on the Beach, the fireworks that happen every summer. It's a very cool place to be for young people, and it's for people with a lot of money live there. Back then, this was a very diverse neighborhood. This is where a lot of migrant communities lived, just outside, 2 blocks outside of downtown Vancouver. So, Khalsa Diwan Society Vancouver. It's not there today. This was built in 1908. So this is potentially, you can believe me, you cannot believe me, I don't really care. I think this is the first ever picture taken of the Gurdwara that survives today, I think. And the reason I think this is because if you look over here, there's a fence, right? Everyone see that? Yeah? But you see over here, there's no fence. Over here, there's no fence. But we know that in the finished product, there's a fence there. Also, the fence here is not built yet. Also, there's some scaffolding over here. There's definitely some construction happening, right? And they changed the exterior in the 30s, so it can't be those renovations. So I think this is the oldest picture ever. There's some wood over here, some lumber. I think they're still building the Gurdwara. I don't think it's open yet. But a lot of people don't believe me, so I don't know. Okay, so this is in Vancouver. We always acknowledge that this unceded Coast Salish territory, the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I want to tell you about this neighborhood, stepping out again, because again, I always think it's important to recognize the pre-colonial history of the land that we're situated on. Kitsilano is named after the First Nations chief, August Jack Katsalano. Kitsilano is kind of the anglicized pronunciation of his name. The reason I want to tell you about that is because really to make us aware of where we are, what territory we're present on. Kitsilano, back then it was called the Fairview District. Now we call it Kitsilano, called the Fairview District. Before that, before the British came in, it was where, I can't remember which band it was, but Chief August Jack Katsalano and those peoples were there. Basically, eventually, the Canadian Pacific Railway came in, made a station there, and I'm really glossing over this history and a little bit smudging the facts here. But essentially, first they, I think, displaced all the indigenous folks into a different part of the city. And then eventually they burned down pretty much their entire community. And then eventually that community had to relocate. But absolutely decimated the population that was there beforehand. And it was in that they built the Fairview District. And recently soon after, it started being called Kitsilano again. But again, it's really that idea of shared space, right? That thing that has such a tragic colonial history eventually became a really important neighborhood for communities like ours, where we were, despite being marginalized, we were able to thrive and survive. So 1908, this Gurdwara Sahib opens. I wrote spiritual, political, and social gathering space for Sikhs and South Asians of various religious backgrounds. Now, we really have to understand what the Gurdwara Sahib meant back then, right? It wasn't like now where you're in Brampton, there's 700 Gurdwara, right? Is it something like that? It's not like that, because back then, it was one institution for not just Sikhs, but everyone from India. There was no masjid, there was no mandir, right? All the practices that happened in here, documented, were only Sikh practices, right? Maharaj Prakash, Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji was installed, the Sangat, all the proceedings were very much Sikh proceedings. But it was just as much a place of refuge for Hindus and Muslims as well. So much so that when this constitution was written, it was written in the constitution that it's a place of refuge, not just for Sikhs, but also for Hindus and Muslims. There's very much a need for people to cooperate across religious barriers. It was very much a need back then. And you'll see this through and through. On top of that, there was nowhere else for them to go. You only got one day off a week back then, Sunday, the Lord's Day, as they said, right? And that's kind of, you know how we all go, like the Gurdwara is always packed on Sunday now? That's kind of how it came about, is because that's the day that everyone had off. You go to India, it's not packed on Sunday. That's not a thing, right? But here, the reason the Gurdwara is packed on Sunday is because that's the day everybody had off. And the only place you had to go was the Gurdwara Sahib. So a lot of I've had the privilege of talking to a lot of elder families that this Gurdwara Sahib was around till the very late 1960s. So people who went to it are still around. And they talk about what their day would look like, even up to the 40s, 50s, 60s, is they would go to the Gurdwara Sahib in the morning, and they'd have the morning divan, right? So they'd have kirtan, they'd have katha, they'd have all that. Then they'd go downstairs, and the langar hall used to be on the bottom floor down here. They'd go downstairs, they'd have langar, and then they'd hang out, right? Kids would play. Later on, and I'm going to share this with you. You can have your own opinions about it. It might not be the most popular thing, but remember, this is the only gathering place people had back then. Sometimes they'd put a white sheet up in the langar hall because someone brought a film reel from India, and they'd watch a movie down there, right? Because they didn't have a theater to go to. That was the world they were living in. And they'd spend all afternoon in the Gurdwara Sahib. They'd hang out, they'd play, they'd chill, and then at the evening time came, they'd head back upstairs, have evening diwan, right? Rara Sahib, Katha Kirtan, go back downstairs, have langar, then go home. That was your Sunday. This was such an important thing for so many people. And you'll notice if you go to Vancouver today and you talk to a lot of those early families, a lot of them don't look like this, right? But for so many of them, the Gurdwara institution is so important because it's all they have. They have so much love for Sikhi. They have so much love for Sikhi inside because it wasn't just about, I'm going because I need to do part, right? It was about, this is where my community is, right? This is where my people are. This is where people who love me are. Because once you left these doors and walked out onto the street, you were not walking out into a friendly world, right? You're walking into a world where people called you names based on what you look like, where people paid you less based on what you look like. People wouldn't educate you based on what you look like. But inside of these doors, that was everything. So really, when we say Jab te saran tumhari aaye, like, these people understand what that means. Because for them, it was a sanctuary. It was everything. It was the utmost place of protection, the safest space that they possibly could imagine. Now, this Gurdwara Sahib, aside from that, it's also the Shahidi Asthan of Jathedar Bhag Singh Ji, who we'll talk about later, and Bhai Badan Singh Ji, who we'll talk about later as well. But yeah, it's the Gurdwara Sahib. You can still go to Kitsilano now because the Gurdwara Sahib's gone. In 1969, what happened is that they built a new Gurdwara Sahib, much bigger. If you've ever been to Vancouver, it's called Khalsawan Society still. A lot of people call it Ross Street Gurdwara. It was for decades the biggest Gurdwara society outside of India, in the entire world. Usually was kind of like the gold standard people to look to, like what's happening at Ross, and then we'll have it over here. A lot of the times, things that would happen when you go later into like the 70s, 80s, 90s is like a big pracharik would come, like a kathavajik or a kirtani. They'd come to Vancouver, to Ross Street, and then people would call them, come to Toronto, come here, come there, right? Because that was like the epicenter of not just the Sikh community in Vancouver, but the Sikh community pretty much like in all of North America. South Vancouver is where you want it to be. So this Gurdwara Sahib closed down in 1969. It's unfortunate because it got torn down. It was sold off and got torn down. And it's easy to sit here now and say like, oh, we should have We do a lot of this in our community, which I love about us. What we do is we hold ourselves to such a high standard, such a ridiculously high standard, right? Be like, oh, asi sochya nahi si, asi sade hathaਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਤਾਂ ਹਾਂ ਸੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਗਵਾ ਲਿਆ. That's what we said, right? But think about the fact that in 1969 you have a growing community that's going through like growing pains, and like it's about survival too, right? Like it's easy to sit here 50 years later and be like, hey, like that kind of sucks, we don't have that Gurdwara Sahib. It's much harder to be in that present moment. We'll be like, we're making a new Gurdwara Sahib because we need more room. We need a bigger Gurdwara Sahib because we need to continue growing as a community, and we can't do it while we have this property by that time, which was condemned, and it was like in such a state of needed to be repaired. Really easy to say that, but for necessity's sake, it had to be sold off. The nice thing about that story is that after it got sold off, it became social housing for a little bit. So it continued to be a place of refuge for people. Even when the new Gurdwara Sahib opened, before it was sold off, a lot of people would still come here when they first landed in Canada and they needed a place to stay. They'd come and stay at the old Gurdwara Sahib. For the first few months, then it was sold. It became social housing for the wider community. And then eventually it was sold off, torn down. Now there's apartments there. But if you go there, this kind of section is still up. And the new apartments are built on top of it. And there used to be a plaque here for the Gurdwara Sahib. Now they've taken it off and made like a proper, like, full kind of mount thing. And so you can still see a plaque with the history of the Gurdwara Sahib written there. That was built by Vancouver Heritage Foundation. It was recognized as one of the 125 most important places in Vancouver's history. So, Khalsa Diwan Society, 2nd Avenue, Gurdwara. And the way that I'm doing this talk today is trying to do, that was kind of all like the context of it. Now I want to focus on people. I want to focus on people most because I really think that's the most interesting thing, is talking about the Gursikhs that were around back then. And we can kind of talk about what was happening in the world situated in the story of those Gursikhs. So this Pankti comes, Ave Sahib Chit Teriya Bhakta Ditya. You come to my mind, O Master, when I behold your devotees. The reason I put this Pankti is because these are high resolution images. And like sometimes you just see a Gursikh and you see them and you're just like, man, what a beautiful soul, right? So if you don't want to stop listening to me, go ahead and just look at the picture because they're beautiful people. So we're starting with this beautiful person, Professor Sant Teja Singh Ji. Professor Sant Teja Singh Ji was kind of like, I would say, the first Sikh celebrity in the Sikh diaspora, okay? Sant Teja Singh was so famous that at their peak, they were living in Vancouver and operating in Vancouver, and newspapers in England were writing about him, like straight up celebrity status. It was amazing. So Professor Sant Teja Singh Ji was an absolutely amazing soul. Studied and worked abroad under the guidance of Sant Atra Singh Ji Mastohane Wale. So a lot of us might be familiar with Sant Atra Singh Ji, often regarded as one of the most influential Sikhs of the 20th century. Professor Sant Teja Singh Ji, just very briefly getting into their history, they were actually not very religious at all. And they called themselves an atheist, right? Very educated, got their law degree got their law degree in India. And then what happened was, after that, became a salt inspector, which was a job for like the British Empire. Didn't like being a salt inspector because they felt it was disingenuous. It wasn't an honest profession. And then started teaching, and then became the vice principal of Khalsa College, also a British-run institution, Khalsa College. But Sant Teja Singh was a teacher at Khalsa College when they were still not a practicing Sikh, right? Was very spiritually inclined. Was very much thinking about helping the world, was very much thinking about spirituality and growing as a person. But they went to they used to go to Arya Samaj, they used to go to a whole bunch of different places seeking like spiritual nourishment. And they even said that I used to read Guru Granth Sahib Ji, but like any other textbook. And they're like just sitting at my table. Like that's how little they were connected to like religious Sikh practice. Then at Khalsa College, Amritsar, Sant Teja Singh Ji became inspired. At one point, again, became so anti-religious that when the students used to have to go to Darbar in the morning, to the Gurudwara, that he would get there before everyone else so he didn't have to matha take. That's kind of how religious practice Sant Teja Singh was. Eventually what happened is Khalsa College, Amritsar, as they started kind of getting more and more connected with Gurbani, they talk about this one experience, and I don't want to talk about it because I couldn't do it justice, but where they were so overcome by the power of Gurbani during Ardas that they fell to their feet and they saw light coming from Maharaj's Swarup. And after that, life changed. Completely life changed. They went and they met Sant Baba Sham Singh Ji, Atna Mandi wale, the Kirtani, very famous Kirtani back then. And they kind of started talking to Baba Sham Singh, like, I'm having these experiences, and they're like, started reading more Gurbani and was so intelligent. By this time, already had like undergrad degree in law school. Was so intelligent, they're like, I want to teach people about Sikhia. I want people to experience what I have. And Sant Baba Sham Singh said, no, you should go meet Sant Atar Singh Ji. And when Sant Teja Singh met Sant Atar Singh, that's when they were like, they kind of really, for the first time, saw for what was them like the perfect human being. And they're like, I just want to serve you, right? And kind of lost that inclination of, I want to go talk to people about what Sikhi is, and just, I want to come on Sikhi. I want to stay with you, and I want to do whatever I can for you because you're such an amazing Gursikh. So that's Sant Teja Singh's brief history before. Then what happens is Sant Teja Singh in this time, in 1906, Sant Teja Singh takes Amrit, and their name before actually was Naranjan Singh, and then after taking Amrit became Teja Singh. And Sant Teja Singh takes Amrit and then eventually gets accepted into University College London at Cambridge University. When they go to Cambridge, and then Sant Atar Singh gives them permission that you should go out and you should serve the Sikh community that's living around the globe, because that time UK had a upcoming community, the US and Canada. And that's what Sant Teja Singh did. They came out to the UK. At University College London, you used to have to wear a gown and a cap. That was the uniform. And Sant Teja Singh, as it said, was the first student to ever not wear a cap at that university, and got into some fights with some professors about it. It was pretty cool. Sant Teja Singh's history is awesome. It's all about Sant Teja Singh went to this city, got into a fight with this professor. The professor fell in love with him, moved on to the next place. After University College London, they got accepted into teacher training at Columbia University, New York. So they came to New York, where they got into a fight with a professor about Rudyard Kipling. Actually, if you're familiar with Rudyard Kipling, the kind of like the voice of the British Empire at that time, the infamous colonial writer. And they got into an argument with the professor because the professor was saying Rudyard Kipling is the humor, the comedic voice of our generation, a true humorist. And Sant Teja Singh said, no, he's not a humorist because a true comedian is full of love and he has no love in his heart. So it's pretty baller. Sant Teja Singh went to Columbia University. Before that finished, when they were at Columbia University, something was going on in Vancouver. And this was, I'm used to speaking in Vancouver, so I'm always pointing here. I know we're not in Vancouver. I'm not delusional. I'm just letting you know. There's an incredible thing happening in these years, 1906, 1907 in Vancouver. And this is one of the most low-key, worst things in history that I've ever heard of. This is called the British Honduras Conspiracy, okay? This is what happened. So we talked about the continuous journey regulation, right? You basically effectively cut off immigration from India. People from India cannot come to Canada anymore in 1906. Now you have a population of 5,000 people. How do you get rid of them? That's the government's problem now. How do we get rid of these people? So what they do is they go to the Sikh community, the South Asian community, and they say, hey, you guys are from India. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. You're from India. It's hot in India. It's cold in Canada. But there's this place called the British Honduras, right? And that's Belize now, if you're familiar. There's this place called the British Honduras. It's much warmer there. You know what? You want to work? You should go to Belize. We'll pay for your ticket. You guys can all move to Belize, work there, and then you can go back to India. Pretty sweet deal for everyone, right? They wanted to mass deport 5,000 brown people. And they tried. Okay, so this is what's happening. Sant Teja Singh's messing stuff up at Columbia University, attracting all this attention. People are writing articles about him. One of those articles in the newspaper was read by a South Asian here in Vancouver named Taraknath Das. Okay, Tarak Nath Das shows this to one of the Gurudwara Sahib Granthi, Bhai Balwant Singh. It's like, oh, this guy sounds cool. And Bhai Balwant Singh is like, yeah, this guy sounds cool, right? He's a lawyer. So they call Sant Teja Singh to come to Vancouver for the first time, saying that, hey, they're trying to deport 5,000 of us. We need someone to help us out. And so Sant Teja Singh shows up in Vancouver to represent the interests of the South Asian community. When they come, they also do tremendous amounts of Sikhi prachar. And there's so many stories about Sant Teja Singh going from Vancouver. So they came to Vancouver. They wrote the constitution for the Khalsa Diwan Society because they never had a constitution yet. They went to Victoria and they inspired the Sikh community that was there to fundraise and build an actual Gurdwara Sahib when they had just been doing Prakash in a house before that. Sant Teja Singh did the first ever Anand Karaj that happened in North America. The first ever wedding that happened, which was between a Sikh convert, a white woman whose name was Annie Wright. You talked about it earlier, also known as Lab Kaur, and Mancha Singh, her husband. So they had an Amrit Sanchar before, right after the Amrit Sanchar. The first ever Anand Karaj that happened was at 2nd Avenue Gurdwara. Sant Teja Singh was the Granthi. And they did the Katha in English back then because obviously the woman didn't know Punjabi. So Sant Teja Singh did tremendous amounts of prachar while they were here. There's stories about them going to Victoria, and the thing that was running rampant in the community at that time was alcoholism, by virtue of the fact that it was usually like people were usually living in bunkhouses, working on mills, bunch of men living together, and no families, no social life beyond that. So a lot of people took to drinking, and and Sant Teja Singh did so much prachar against drinking that they would be at places one night with people who were like drinking that night, and the next morning they'd be doing prachar at the Gurdwara about like the dangers of like falling to alcohol, and then the next day they'd have an Amrit Sanchar, and the people that were drinking the night before would take Amrit the next day. That's how incredible the amount of prachar they did. Also an absolutely fearless prachar. They came back and forth from Vancouver a few times. 1912, one of my favorite stories about Sant Teja Singh is when the Victoria Gurdwara that they inspired to start fundraising and build was eventually built, opened in 1912. They had a Nagar Kirtan in the capital of BC, Victoria. Sant Teja Singh was behind, first they had Maharaj Swarup, behind that Sant Teja Singh was on horseback holding a 3-foot kirpan, okay? 100 years ago, just like, I'm gonna hold a 3-foot kirpan, I don't care. Then on each corner they would stop, and this is written in the Victoria Times Colonist, the local publication in Victoria, and they said that he would stop at every single corner and he would preach about the Sikh faith and about politics on each corner, right? And he would talk about things like, you guys, you're calling yourself Christians, but the way that you rule over land is not according to the goodwill of the Christian faith. He would say things like, this is the coolest thing that he would say. They would take their kirpan, right? And at one point, and this is written as a quote, and I'm paraphrasing again, he said, this is mostly ceremonial, but they're like, but if it comes down to it, it can be used when a particularly stubborn ego needs to be slashed. So that's a pretty fearless thing to say 125 years ago when you're really just thinking about survival. And they're like, yeah, we're thinking about survival, but also we have big kirpans and we like them. So but it was amazing. Sant Teja Singh was so influential that in that time, the Province newspaper, I don't know if you've heard of it, or if you but it's one of our main publications in Vancouver. It's the Vancouver Sun and the Province. The Province newspaper in December of one of those years did a full page just article about this guy. And they called him like this mystic of like this Buddhist mystic because they didn't know how to define him. And they talked about how people, even though Sant Teja Singh's very young at this time, how people would be walking down the street and like treat him like they said the word deity. They treat him like a deity. They had so much respect for him because the amount of prachar he did, and not just the amount of prachar he did on a Sikhi level, but also how fearless he was in addressing the political power of the time. Right? Absolutely unwavering in the face of political authority. So obviously it's kind of the best person to represent the community when they're trying to deport you. So Sant Teja Singh comes to this agreement with the government during the British Honduras scheme, saying that we can't go to a place that we've never seen before. So they said, you send a couple of representatives, take 2 of our people, and then go down to Belize, go to the British Honduras, and they'll write a report. And they come back, they present it to the community. If we like the report, win-win. We don't have to be here if it's better for us down there. They're like, but if we don't like the report, we're going to stay here. So the government agrees. They send them down. Two South Asians go, one Sikh, one Hindu. They go down, they come back with the report, and they come back with something a little bit more than a report. First, they tell Sant Teja Singh and everybody that basically it's a total lie. That there's already Indians living in Belize or in the British Honduras. There's already people there, and they're indentured servants. So basically, they work for free, but the thing was like they had like contracts. If you work for this many years on this plantation or whatever, and you can live here for free, and then eventually you'll get some shares. But they were making next to no money at all. It was almost as bad as slavery, was kind of how they described it. And the people the locals that were living there, that was the migrant population from Punjab that was already there, they were like to him, they're like, don't come here. The people that were already there were like, don't come here, it's so bad. And so those two came back with this news, but then they also told Sant Teja Singh something else particularly interesting. They said, while we were down there, there was one immigration inspector and one person translating. The person translating, his name was William C. Hopkinson, and we'll come back to him in a second. But he said, while we were down there, this guy Hopkinson offered us a bribe of, I think, $4,000 to write a good report. So straight up, now we have government officials who are giving money to people to lie, off the books. Okay? Sant Teja Singh, again, very politically savvy, doesn't start a rumor, calls a press conference in Vancouver and outs them and says, this is what the government is doing to us. They're offering bribes, they're doing this, they're doing that. Eventually the British Honduras scheme failed. But it's really because of Sant Teja Singh's like incredible political maneuvering and understanding of how to represent the community and what the limitations of the government were that they were able to do that. An absolutely incredible figure. I could talk about them forever. If you're interested, there's a book called, it's at the end of the presentation, but that really gets into their life that I suggest that you read. Sant Teja Singh, one of the foremost representatives of the Panth of the time. After Sant Teja Singh is this Gursikh Shaheed Bhai Balwant Singh Ji Khuradpur. And Bhai Balwant Singh Ji's story is kind of like Sant Teja Singh's in the sense that it transcends just the story of Vancouver. Some of these people are like very much about the local story, but people like Sant Teja Singh, who's, again, the rest of their life, Sant Teja Singh's life, is worth reading about too. The amount of seva they did for the Sikh world when they went back to India was incredible up until they passed away in 1965. Bhai Balwant Singh Khuradpur comes into this category of someone who was not just someone to know about in Vancouver, but someone to know about across the entire world. Let me tell you about Bhai Balwant Singh. Bhai Balwant Singh was in the British Indian military, like many of the people who were coming to Vancouver at the time. And Bhai Balwant Singh Ji was inspired to follow Sikhi while in the military because Sant Baba Karam Singh Ji, if you're familiar with them, Hoti Mardan Wale, were also in the military back then. And Sant Baba Karam Singh influenced Bhai Balwant Singh Ji at that time to come into Sikhi, and that's what they did. So Bhai Balwant Singh Ji becomes like this like very staunch practicing Sikh. They take Amrit and then they move here to Vancouver. That first Gurdwara Sahib, Khalsa Diwan Society, 2nd Avenue. Bhai Balwant Singh Ji was the first Granthi there. I've heard, this isn't confirmed, but it's nice to talk about. I've heard from a few places that the Knee Patthar, the foundation stone of the Gurdwara Sahib, was laid by Bhai Balwant Singh. Their family continues to live in Duncan, BC today, which is just on Vancouver Island. It's a small town. But again, a fearless activist. So Bhai Balwant Singh Ji and Bhai Pag Singh Ji, I'm going to talk about them later. They're both very close, and they're both the leaders of the community in Vancouver at this time. Because their activism wasn't limited just to what was happening in that moment in front of them, but it transcended barriers of all kinds. So, is everyone here familiar with Lieutenant Governor Michael O'Dwyer? If you've heard of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, 1919, Amritsar, April is the 100th anniversary this year. It's when there was a protest in Amritsar, and the British Indian military opened fire on a bunch of protesters and ended up killing many. The memorial's still there, not too far from Darbar Sahib. Harmandir Sahib. If you go to Amritsar, it's definitely worth visiting. I don't want to get too much into the history. The general who did that shooting, his name was Dyer, and the lieutenant governor who endorsed this like what's considered one of the worst massacres in the history of the British Empire across all countries. The person who endorsed that was Michael O'Dwyer. And if you ever heard of Shahid Bhai Udham Singh, Shahid Udham Singh was the one who shot Michael O'Dwyer. So Michael O'Dwyer was like the head, the person in charge in Punjab. Lieutenant governor was pretty much the person who everything went through. That was Michael O'Dwyer. And Michael O'Dwyer writes in his own personal diary that he was scared of Bhai Balwant Singh, right? And the viceroy, which is another position of power, he wrote a letter to the viceroy because Bhai Balwant Singh ji, a few years after this, before they were hanged, was going back to India. And they wrote a letter to the viceroy, and they used these words: inimitable revolutionary. There's nothing fake about this guy. That this guy really is a revolutionary and ready to do anything. And they said, you really don't have to worry about the group, but if there's one person that you have to worry about, it's Bhai Balwant Singh. Bhai Balwant Singh struck so much fear into the heart of the British Empire. It's really quite inspiring. So Bhai Balwant Singh ji's activity was immense. If there was something going on, a major moment in the Sikh community, in the South Asian community, whether in India or outside, Bhai Balwant Singh ji was involved. There's no doubt. The Kamagata Maru, if you're here to hear about the Kamagata Maru, I'm kind of skipping it today. People talk about the Kamagata Maru a lot. There's a lot of resources. I'll touch on it briefly. But it's not going to be the focus, and I apologize for that if that's what you were kind of looking for, because I know that's kind of like the big history that everyone knows about. I think you have a park in Brampton now too, Kamagata Maru Park or something like that. So like I know that that's like the story everyone wants to know, but it is accessible, and I'll give you resources where you can learn more about it. But I'm going to be glossing over it. But I'll probably refer to it a couple of times. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it doesn't matter. So. Not that it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter that you don't know what I'm talking about. But Bhai Balwant Singh ji was involved with the Kamagata Maru when it was going from India to Vancouver, and it stopped in East Asia. Bhai Balwant Singh ji was there to talk to them and do some of that communication. When it came to some of the Shahidis that came a few years before their own Shahidi, Bhai Balwant Singh ji was there witnessing them. When it came to a lot of the revolutionary activity that's happening on the ground in Vancouver, Bhai Balwant Singh ji was there usually leading that activity. Eventually, they were hanged in the Lahore conspiracy cases, which you might be familiar with. Essentially, the show trials that happened in Lahore related to the Ghadar movement in 1917. But again, even the story of their Shahidi is so incredible and it shows how much the British Empire was afraid of Bhai Balwant Singh, because they actually executed Bhai Balwant Singh one day before the execution was scheduled. And it was a particularly devastating thing for Bhai Balwant Singh ji's wife, Bibi Kartar Kaur ji. Bibi Kartar Kaur, because she came to the jail the day of the execution to see Bhai Balwant Singh for a last time before the execution was supposed to happen. And instead of seeing Bhai Balwant Singh, she was handed his possessions, right, which included his Gotka Sahib. A really devastating thing. But the reason that Bhai Balwant Singh was executed a day early was because the empire was afraid that if that this is one of those executions that's going to be celebrated, and it's going to invigorate the movement. It's not going to help stop it. So they said the less people know about it when it's happening, the more devastating it'll be, the less inspiring it'll be. And that's exactly what ended up happening. Bhai Balwant Singh ji was executed in secret a day before when they were meant to be executed. But this is a particular thing I want to discuss about Bhai Balwant Singh right here. Professor Sohn Singh Pooney is from Vancouver, is an amazing Ghadar historian, consults on a lot of the historical work that other people do around the Ghadar party. Described Bhai Balwant Singh as the spirit and soul of the Ghadar party in Vancouver. So it's time to talk about the Ghadar party, because I've said it a couple of times. The Ghadar party was, and we probably know people associated with the Ghadar party usually more into the 30s and beyond, right? Bhai Ranveer Singh ji, Bhagat Singh, those kind of famous figures, Shahid Udham Singh, those figures are really associated with the Ghadar party later on. And Kartar Singh Srabha is the big one. Kartar Singh Srabha is another one. None of those people who we'll be discussing today, it's a little bit outside of the scope. But the Ghadar party was really formed in North America. So The Ghadar Party was a movement that sought the the overthrow of the British rule in India through armed resistance. This is what separated the Ghadar Party from other movements, right? Specifically from Gandhi, was that they were believers and practicers of armed resistance. Now, the Ghadar Party actually didn't start in India. The Ghadar Party started here on the west coast of North America. So it started in a little place called Astoria, which is in Oregon, a really random place for anything to happen, let alone this. But it's when you look at the history of the Sikh community in North America, it's very much a West Coast like thing. It's from Vancouver all the way down to San Francisco. It's just like one big connection. A lot of the movement happened up and down there. A lot of the activity happened up and down there. Bhai Balwant Singh Ji was called the spirit and soul of the Ghadar Party in Vancouver, and Vancouver was kind of like the hub of a lot of Ghadar activity. The other place was, if you've ever been down to Stockton, California, and Berkeley, California. Stockton has the oldest Gurdwara Sahib in the U.S. I urge you to go there. They've maintained a lot of it, which is really amazing, and they have a museum set up too. But Stockton, California, and Berkeley, where a lot of the students were, who were kind of like pushing this revolution along. Most famously, someone named Kartar Singh Sarabha, if you're familiar with him. So this Ghadar Party connection goes all the way down the West Coast. And the Ghadar Party is kind of like this two-pronged attack. Because on one side, they're like trying to overthrow the British government in India. But by extension, because they're in Vancouver, they're challenging the British rule in Canada as well. Because it's kind of that identifying of the same oppressor, right? So it becomes kind of like a local civil rights movement at the same time. The Ghadar Party in India isn't so much that, because it's obviously just about what's happening there. But in North America, it becomes this like pan-Indian, like revolutionary, like entity, right? So Bhai Balwant Singh Ji is called the spirit and soul of the Ghadar Party in Canada by Professor Sohn Singh, and if you look at, and this is really interesting, because Bhai Balwant Singh also, according to Professor Sohn Singh, Bhai Balwant Singh was also involved in one activist thing, which was outside of the Sikh community, and that was he was one of the founders of the Socialist Party of Canada's Vancouver chapter, right? It's really interesting. And so in these early years, there's a lot of interest in the Russian Revolution from the Ghadar Party, because they see it as like labor, like it's the working class, and they're overthrowing these people, and they're doing it through armed resistance. So they really identified with that, and so you'll see that a lot of the I don't know how it is here in Toronto, but in Vancouver, a lot of the times people are separated into two categories. Like, you're the Singhs, you're the comrades. I don't know if you've heard that before. I don't know if that's a thing here. Is that a thing here? No? Someone from Toronto, come on, give me a heads up. No, it's not a thing here. It is? It is? Cool, thank you. And the way, usually comrade is said by usually someone who's like Amritari or something, like they don't believe in God, they're comrades, right? And the comrades, like, these are Singhs, they don't believe in the cause, they're just religious people, blah, blah, blah. But back then, the Singhs were the comrades. So it's really interesting how those politics played out over the next century. Bhai Balwant Singh Ji. And hand in hand with Bhai Balwant Singh Ji comes Shahid Jathedar Bhag Singh. Shahid Jathedar Bhag Singh is another one of those people that really close to my heart, speaks to me. And that's this person right here. And this is the family, Bibi Harnam Kaur Ji and their son Joginder Singh. Also ex-military and police officer in the British Army. Bhai Bhag Singh's story is a little different than Bhai Balwant Singh's, because it wasn't military influence that they got into Sikhi. According to Dr. Mahendra Singh Tillon, who's another historian, is that Jathedar Bhag Singh came to Bhai Balwant Singh in contact with them in Vancouver, and was then inspired to follow the path of Sikhi. So they took Amrit here in Vancouver. Bhai Bhag Singh joined the Gurdwara Sahib right away, first secretary of the 2nd Avenue Gurdwara, became president eventually. And Bhai Bhag Singh is one of those stories that it's a concrete example of something we know that happened a lot. Something that happened a lot was someone served for a long time under the British Empire, Faujvich, right, Polsvich or something like that. They'd be in the military or the police, and then they'd show up here and they'd be like, cool, like, we're part of the empire. This is a part of the empire. Things should be good here. And they get here, and they're like, I'm just a brown person, right? That's essentially what it became, is that it doesn't matter that I served the queen and the king. It doesn't matter that I was a loyalist. All that matters is what I look like, and the discrimination doesn't change from there. And so a lot of those people flipped back then and became hardcore anti-colonial activists, right? And they're the ones that started leading the Ghadar party. That's why you'll see Bhai Balwant Singh ji was in the Fauj, Bhai Bhag Singh was in the Fauj, because they were disillusioned, right? They came with this one understanding that this is what the empire is. They come here and they're like, oh no, this is what the empire is, but I don't have that same relationship with it anymore, right? Here, I'm just a brown guy, and they can do whatever they want to me. They can do whatever they want against me. Bhai Bhag Singh is the most extreme example of that, because they become so disillusioned. And then some of the other activists at the time, even especially the non-Sikh activists, Taraknath Das is one of them, they inspire Bhai Bhag Singh, Bhai Balwant Singh to take on this Ghadar cause, right? And what ends up happening is there becomes this relationship between the Gurdwara Sahib and the Ghadar party, right? Because a lot of these Ghadari Babbe or Ghadarites are the executive committee of the Gurdwara Sahib as well, right? And I also want to address this thing of the executive committee of the Gurdwara Sahib. Don't think like today's committees, right? We all have things to think about today's committees. I'm sure we do. But it's not so much about Pradhangi back then, where when you were the president of the Gurdwara Sahib, the expectations were up here, right? Because the expectations on everyone else were already here. The expectation was high on everybody. The community, you had to perform better, 1,000,000 times better than everyone else, because that was the situation that you're living in. So Khalsa Diwan Society held all its members in very, very, very high, at a very, very high discipline. If you look at it, sometimes the things that the Gurdwara Sahib would comment on wouldn't even be religious things. One of the orders issued by the Khalsa Diwan Society to the Sikhs of Vancouver was that if you're a member of this society and you want to leave your house, you have to wear a 3-piece suit, your shoes have to be polished, and you have to have a pocket watch. That was one of the things. The reason was because there's so much discrimination already that you can't leave your house looking anything less than perfect. Right? So often that's why you'll see a lot of the times, all these people are dressed really nicely. But a lot of the times they're not expensive suits and stuff, but they're always wearing a suit. They always have their shoes polished. They always have a pocket watch on, because they know they have to represent the community. The president of the Gurdwara Sahib, the executive committee, is held in an even higher discipline than that. And so when Bhai Bhag Singh is the president of the Gurdwara, they really have a lot of responsibility. And I wrote this right here. They also lived across the street from the Gurdwara Sahib, which is really nice. That their house is also gone, but it's just Bhag Singh's death certificate as well is also available. Even though they lived across the street from the Gurdwara Sahib, when it lists their usual residence, the address that's written is the address of the Gurdwara Sahib, not the address of their house, which is a really beautiful thing of showing how that was a sense of place for them, how it was a sense of home. But this thing is fearlessly anti-colonial, and this is how I define Jathedar Bhag Singh. Two stories just show how dope he was. So, King Edward was coming to Vancouver, the monarch of the time, and the city and everyone was getting together, and they're like, okay, all the service people are going to get together, and we're going to greet the king, right? In downtown Vancouver with a parade. And we're inviting all the military people. So they call up the Gurdwara Sahib, because they know that all these people are associated with, or many of them used to be in the British Indian military. And they said, King Edward's coming, come out. We want all the ex-Indian officers to come and be there with us when we greet the king. But Bhag Singh didn't ask anyone and just said, we don't need you. Outright rejected the invitation, and just said, your king can come all he wants, but we're not coming. Some people were upset about this actually, because they were saying that you never consulted the community, right? So some people of their own accord dressed up in their military outfits and went, but the Khalsa Diwan Society refused to greet the king, right? Let's take a moment to think about that. And now think about the last time you saw a politician enter the Gurdwara and how much everybody freaked out. That's all I'll say about that. So it's a bit different, I'm guessing, right? How fast we're ready to sell out now for a politician who's making a really easy statement, whereas the king of the empire was coming and they rejected the invitation. Something to think about. Another story about Bhai Bhag Singh to show how fiercely anti-colonial Bhai Bhag Singh Ji was. In 1910, Jathedar Bhag Singh gathered all of the sympathetic servicemen in the military, and they basically made a pyre outside of the Gurdwara Sahib on the streets of Vancouver, and everybody burned their medals, they burned their uniforms, they burned their honored certificates, everything they ever had received from the British Empire. They had this kind of swearing off of the empire. They all burned them in the street. That was a cause led by Jathedar Bhag Singh Ji as well. So the thing was, Jathedar Ji was very fiercely anti-colonial. Many of the leadership was, but not everybody was. And that's where problems in this time start to arise. This is 1910s-ish, okay? And because of these problems, Bhai Bhag Singh Ji eventually gets assassinated inside of the Gurdwara Sahib. They become shaheed. And it says that at the bottom, but I'm going to get to that in just a little bit. Right now, I want to focus on another amazing human being, and that's this person right here, Bibi Harnam Kaur Ji. So Bibi Harnam Kaur was one of the first South Asian women to be allowed entry into Canada as an act of grace, along with Bibi Kartar Kaur Ji, who I mentioned earlier, was Bhai Balwant Singh Ji's partner. So Bibi Kartar Kaur, Bibi Harnam Kaur. So what happened was, Bhai Balwant Singh, Bhai Bhag Singh, this is about 1910, 11, just when all this stuff is really heating up, 1910, 1911, right? Things are getting really anti-colonial and really activist things for rights against the rights from the government is really starting to heat up. So Jathedar Bhag Singh, Bhai Balwant Singh, they decide that we need to head-on challenge this law that women are not allowed into this country. So the two of them traveled back to India. They got Bibi Harnam Kaur, Bibi Kartar Kaur, and they just brought them back. They're like, let's go. And Bibi Harnam Kaur, Bibi Kartar Kaur, knowing that they were not allowed into Canada, the sheer amount of bravery that must have taken, they're like, let's go. We're gonna go challenge this racist immigration law that we know nothing about. Is absolutely incredible. And that's what they do. And they're denied entry multiple times. So they come to Vancouver, they're denied entry, they have to go back somewhere in Asia, and I'm forgetting where exactly. Then they're like, okay, let's try going through San Francisco. So they come on another ship back to San Francisco, denied entry, go back to Asia, then come to Vancouver again. So each time this journey's taking months, right? It's not just it's not like an 18-hour flight to India. Each journey takes months by ship. And each one is traveling by ship is not ideal conditions. There's smokestacks and there's smoke all around you all the time. Tight quarters, so you're surrounded by people. One person gets sick, everybody gets sick. It's one of those situations. So Bibi Harnam Kaur, Bibi Kartar Kaur end up in Vancouver after a few attempts. Bhai Bhag Singh, Bhai Balwant Singh are let into the country because they were in Canada before the continuous journey regulation. They had already cleared that immigration, you're allowed back in. But they're not. One, because it's their first time here. Two, because they're women. So the two of them spent about 6 months in jail in Vancouver. And then eventually there was so much activity from the community and it was looking so bad for the Canadian government that after 6 months of activism from the community and resilience from these two incredible women, eventually the government caved and said, okay, these two are allowed in, and they called it an act of grace, right? They said, this doesn't mean the law is changing. Women still aren't allowed to come. That was very important that they established that. They said, this time we're letting it happen because we're nice guys. That's pretty much what it was. That's what an act of grace is. And that's what Bibi Harnam Kaur Ji did. But Bibi Ji was very young. So in that time, when they went back to, the first time when they went from San Francisco back to Hong Kong, in Hong Kong, the entire time Bibi Ji was pregnant. And so she had a baby, Joginder Singh, the one that's in the last picture, this one, in Hong Kong. And then again, got on a ship and the three of them came back to Vancouver. The amount of trauma that must inflict on a person's body is you can't even imagine, right? What happened was Bibi Ji was here for a few years. In this news article, this is after she passed away. She passed away after she gave birth to her second child. And her second child, whose name was Karm Kaur, was born here in Vancouver. And Bibi Ji passed away 9 days after giving birth to Karm Kaur, and that was in 1914, a couple of years later, leaving Bhag Singh with just the two children. Bibi was 28 when she passed away, 28. And just recently, actually, I had a chance to see her death certificate, and it's really one of the most, like, I feel like I've seen so many things in archives and stuff, right? That you have inspirational moments, but there's not a lot of moments that really push you to the point where, like, it's like, man, that just sucks. You know what I'm saying? Obviously, like, her dein to the panth, her dein to humanity, her contribution to our world's history is untouchable, and I'm grateful for that. But there's this human part of you that also is kind of just like, man, oh, that just hits you really hard. Because when we looked at her death certificate, it said there that she was a chronic asthmatic. And now you're thinking about the fact that she's been traveling on steamships her entire life as a chronic asthmatic. That really hit me. Is that it's one thing for just anyone to do it, but someone who has asthma to be traveling by the only means, not for her personal gain, but for the gain of her community, is immense. It's incredible. I can't put that into words. So she passed away because she got a fever about 9 days after the birth of Karam Kaur. But that's Bibi Harnam Kaur ji. And just to show like what kind of amazing personality she had, when she passed away, she willed her money to a school for young orphan girls in Amritsar. Like, that's what she did with her money. A lot of the times when we tell the stories of the early Sikhs that came here, said they came here to work an honest, hard living and send it back to their families. But if that's what they were doing, they wouldn't have built Gurdwara, right? They wouldn't have given thousands of dollars to charity. They wouldn't have willed the last, when her whole family is here, she wouldn't have willed her money to young orphan children in Amritsar. They're very much community-minded people, right? It's really incredible. At the time, this is the biggest, when she passed away, it was the biggest funeral in Vancouver's South Asian community ever. The more people came there than anywhere else. There's this incredible image of Bibiji's Antam Sanskar, where her body's on the pyre, and the whole community's around her. And you can see so many people in that picture. And it's just this really like incredible moment of like, wow, like all these people were here then doing this amazing work. And it just makes you really aware of the present too, that we're surrounded by so many amazing Gursikhs, and sometimes we don't just take a stop. Like I look at the experienced Sikhi folks, and like I feel like in 5 years, in 10 years, I can look back and like look at a picture and be like, all these amazing Gursikhs were doing this amazing work at the same time and at the same kind of moment. It's rather beautiful. But that's Bibi Harnam Kaur ji. Bibi Kartar Kaur ji, very similar story. She survived, right? She came back from India eventually after Bhai Balwant Singh became Shaheed. And when she was living here, she lived her whole life here, and her family lives in Duncan now. She passed away, I don't know when. I've been trying to track it down actually for the last few weeks. But she passed away sometime in the 1900s. But her grandchildren are still around. And Bhai Balwant Singh ji's 100th Shaheedi Divas passed in 2017. And one of the Gurdwara Sahibs in BC celebrated that, and their family came down and they presented Bhai Sahib's like biography and stuff. It was very nice. Anyway, Bibi Harnam Kaur ji. Which brings us to Bhai Meva Singh ji. So if you follow me on Instagram, you've probably seen a lot of pictures of Bhai Meva Singh before. This all kind of culminates. So I just want to walk you through the activity that's happening in the community at that time. What time are we at? 4:35? Is that what it is? Okay. And I'll wrap up in the next 25 minutes. That sounds like a plan? So everything culminates to this. I'm going to just quickly review where we've been, okay? Because it's been a lot. And thank you so much for your patience. I really appreciate your energy. 1904, Sikhs start coming. 1904 to 1906, about 5,000 South Asians come here. 1906, immigration's cut off. 1906, 7, 8, British Honduras scheme, right? 1908, Khalsa Diwan Society is built. And 1908 to we're about 1914 now, activities picking up, right? We're trying to challenge immigration barriers. Women are trying to start coming in. And then in this time as well, I also mentioned one person earlier during the British Honduras scheme, whose name was William C. Hopkinson. Now, we have pictures of William C. Hopkinson. I didn't include them. Because if you remember the pankti we started with, Ave Sahib Chit Tere Apagta Ditya. There are some villains in this story. And I was like, why do we want to see their moves? We don't want to see their faces, right? It's Fridat Namok Daravana, right? So we don't want to see their scary faces. So let's look at the faces of Gurmukhs. But I'll tell you about those stories, those characters too. I'll share those with you. William C. Hopkinson was the guy, let's revisit, that gave the bribe to those two people that went down to the British Honduras, right? That was William C. Hopkinson's first ever job in Canada. He came to Canada in 1906. It was his first job. He got hired by the immigration department to be an interpreter. The reason he was hired as an interpreter was because he had lived in India his whole life, in Calcutta. That's where he was from. So he could speak Hindi fluently. He could read and write it. He could also understand Punjabi. He could speak it, but not very well, not as well as he could speak Hindi. And I think he was comfortable with Urdu as well. He couldn't read or write Punjabi. I don't think he could read or write Urdu either. But eventually he came here. The thing is, Hopkinson's interesting because Hopkinson looked like a white guy, but he wasn't. Hopkinson was an Anglo-Indian. His mom was a Hindu. She was Indian, she was a Hindu. And his dad was white, British. And they had a child, and that was Hopkinson. Now, Anglo-Indians were persecuted against in India. They weren't persecuted against, but they were also suffered under the system of oppression to some extent. That was because as white people, they were always considered a part of the British class, right? The people who were ruling India. So they weren't accepted by the common people. By the British people, they were considered not pure. So what happened was they usually lived in the British world, but they didn't see the success that other British people usually saw. So maybe you're gonna do a job that another British person would do, but you're probably not gonna get promoted, right? You'll never be nobility. You'll never be in that elite class of British people that are really calling the shots in India, but you're in that world. But they're really they're kind of you're still an Indian, right? So that's kind of the dynamic that they lived in. It's a tough world to operate. Hopkinson came here, and he didn't tell anyone that because he passed as a white guy. He said he was from Yorkshire. And he was a police officer in Calcutta, which was true, he was. And he said that's where he learned Hindi. So that's kind of Hopkinson's story. He comes here, and these people hire him, and nobody knows that he's half Hindu. It doesn't really affect the story in any way, but it's just really interesting to know. Because it really makes you wonder, once you see what Hopkinson did over the years, really makes you wonder why he would go to that extent to the things he did. So it starts here. This is where he starts. He gets hired by the immigration department. As the interpreter, he goes down with this delegation to interpret between the South Asian delegation and the government. And then eventually, he's like, here's $4,000, just let's make this all go away. Whether that was of his own accord or someone told him to do it, we don't know. Probably someone told him to do it. I'm guessing a new immigrant to Canada, even if they're white, probably doesn't have $4,000 to throw around to bribe somebody. But that's their first job. Hopkinson did such a good job when he comes back that he gets a full-time job at the immigration department. He's the interpreter. So Hopkinson's job in the immigration department from 1906 until 1914 is to spy on the South Asian community. On the books, his job is to interpret, right? You're just translating documents, you're translating for people. Also on the books, but a little more off the books, is go spy on them for us, right? And so what he did is he had a ring of spies, right? Often apne, right? The most famous one being Bela Singh Jion. And these ring of spies would go around and they would spy on the community. So because of this Ghadar movement that was going on, because of the quest for rights in Canada, what happened is these spies would go, they'd collect what was being said, and they'd come back to the immigration department, give them the news, and they'd get paid in return for the information. That was the system that Hopkinson had. Really off the books, Hopkinson had a whole other jugaad going on. Because Hopkinson was accused of making people fake passports, for organizing people's deportations, for bribing people, for threatening them, for getting them beat up. All of this, and eventually getting people assassinated. All of this was in Hopkinson's realm of possibility. And that's what he did. So he was considered the person, even though there was people on top of him, there was the MP of Vancouver, there was the head of the department, there was a prime minister, even though there's people in higher power, he was the problem, even though he was the lowest level employee, because he was the one that was able to execute all these things, right? He's the one that could speak Hindi and get people on his side. He's the one that could get people to betray the community. He's the one that could collect information and translate it. Sometimes translate it accurately and conveniently, sometimes not if he felt like it, right? That was Hopkinson. Hopkinson's got two big thorns in his side, okay? His job, because he works not just for the Canadian government, he also works for the US government. He also works for the India government, the British Indian government. So his job is to make sure that no one's seeking for civil rights in Canada, no one's demonstrating, no one's doing that in the US, and no one's trying to foment revolution in India, right? So the Ghadar Party was kind of the big thing for Hopkinson. And the two biggest parts of the Ghadar Party that were bothering Hopkinson were Bhai Bhag Singh, Bhai Balwant Singh, right? Because they're the ones that are inspiring everyone. They're the ones that are rallying everybody. They're the ones that are at the roots of the revolution here. There are others as well. Hussain Rahim's one of them. I'll talk about them very briefly at the end. But these two are the big ones, Bhai Balwant Singh and Bhai Bhag Singh. Which brings us to Bhai Meva Singh ji. Bhai Meva Singh is not a revolutionary leader. Bhai Meva Singh's not a jathedar. Bhai Meva Singh's not a bulara. Bhai Meva Singh's not a politician. Bhai Meva Singh is an everyday Sikh. Bhai Meva Singh came here in about 1906. 1908, they got inspired to take Amrit. And Bhai Meva Singh was a kirtani. They used to do kirtan at the Gurdwara, right? And we know that they used to do kirtan because it's documented. I don't know if they ever learned kirtan. I don't know if they just sang and the Sangat sang along. Everything we know about Bhai Meva Singh that's documented, Bhai Meva Singh was a regular everyday Sikh and had a tremendous amount of respect for everyone just for being this very humble everyday Gursikh. But Bhai Meva Singh was sympathetic with the Ghadar cause, right? Bhai Bhag Singh ji, Bhai Balwant Singh, he rolled in those circles. Like he knew what that was all about, but he was never at the forefront. What happened? One day, in 1914, in June, Bhai Bhag Singh, Bhai Balwant Singh, Babu Harnam Singh, and Bhai Meva Singh have this plan. It's a Harnam Singh, Bhag Singh, Balwant Singh. Those three have a plan. Because at this time, the Kamagara Maru ship, which was, and I'll go one sentence summary of what the Kamagara Maru was. It was a ship that came from India with 376 passengers who were trying to challenge the color bar to Canada, the continuous journey regulation. They were saying that it is a racist regulation, we want to challenge it, and we're going to try to fight in courts and try to get into the country. They took a 2-month journey from India, made some stops in Asia along the way, then came here. They stayed in Burrard Inlet, just outside downtown Vancouver, for 2 months. In those 2 months, sometimes they'd go days without food, water. People would get sick. The Canadian government tried to remove them as best they could. They used force sometimes and tried to take the ship away in the middle of the night. That didn't work. The passengers fought back. Eventually, they had a court case where they took one passenger off the Kamagara Maru and they said, if this person's allowed to stay, then everyone's allowed to stay. It's pretty easy to fight against one person's case to stay in the country. So they had the case. They said, he's not allowed to stay. Nobody's allowed to stay. Eventually, it made a 2-month journey back to India. And then when they arrived in Baj, which was the port in India where they came back, the British Indian military opened fire on a lot of them. They arrested a lot of them. Some of them were tortured to death, and many of them were detained for some time, and some were put on trains and sent back to Punjab by force. That's a 30-second summary of the Kamagara Maru. But in those 2 months that the Kamagara Maru ship that was sitting in Burrard Inlet, Bhag Singh, Balwant Singh, Harnam Singh, and a bunch of other leaders, they were like, hey, they need to be able to protect themselves, right? So what they needed to do was provide them with arms. And so what do? They go where anyone who's looking to buy a gun goes. They went to the US. Even back then, 125 years ago, they're like, oh, gun control, okay. But that's what they did. So and Bhai Meva Singh ji being kind of down with Bhai Bhag Singh guys, and they knew that he was sympathetic, they're like, hey, come with us. We're going to the US to help the passengers of the Kamagara Maru. Bhai Meva Singh, Pola Pala Gor said, like, okay, let's go. So they go down. They go to Bellingham, which is just beneath Vancouver there in Washington State, near Seattle. They stock up on a few pistols and revolvers and some ammunition, and they're crossing back, right? The thing is, Bhai Meva Singh, because is like the most low key out of all of them, nobody knows him, they give Bhai Meva Singh all the weapons, right? So Bhai Meva Singh's got like 6 guns and like ammunition in their shoes and stuff, and is trying to cross the border. Gets caught. I mean, that was probably going to get caught, let's be real. But they get caught. He's taken into interrogation, and Hopkinson is the one who interrogates him. And Hopkinson goes to Bhai Meva Singh and says, what are you doing? Bhai Meva Singh, and this is the amazing thing about Bhai Meva Singh's story, you can, from the moment Bhai Meva Singh's name is mentioned in history, primary source documents, to the moment that Bhai Meva Singh gives Shahidi, I defy you to find a moment where Bhai Meva Singh lies. Because if you read Bhai Meva Singh's statement from this day, tells him everything that happens. Okay, tells him everything. Be like, they took me. I didn't really know where we were going. We went down. I had the stuff. We were crossing the border. That's it, right? Hopkinson's trying to bribe him. Hopkinson's not interested in Bhai Meva Singh, right? Like, who is this guy? That's what Hopkinson's thinking. Like, this guy doesn't matter to me. Hopkinson's interested in Bhai Pag Singh, Bhai Balwant Singh, because Hopkinson's interested in the U.S. government, the Canadian government, the British Indian government, right? Doesn't want those two staying in Canada because they're leading revolution, like the civil rights activity on the street. Doesn't want them going to the US for the same reason. Doesn't want them to go back to India because we saw how much Bhai Balwant Singh was feared by the British Empire, right? We saw how much Bhai Pag Singh, how much of an influence Bhai Pag Singh had. Didn't want them going back to India and fomenting revolution over there. So what Hopkinson wants to do is put them in jail. And now he's got this golden opportunity. And Hopkinson says to Bhai, because all the stuff was on Bhai Meva Singh's person. So while the others were detained, Bhai Meva Singh was the only one with the criminal charge, right, of smuggling arms. And he says that if you give me the evidence to indict those guys, I'll let you go. Straight up. Just all you have to do is say those guys did everything and they forced me to do this. Bhai Meva Singh refused. Like, I'm not going to do that. It's not true. So what ended up happening was there wasn't evidence to throw Bhai Pag Singh and Bhai Balwant Singh Ji in jail. So he had to let everyone go. But for Bhai Meva Singh, Hopkinson was a very conniving person. He had a very good understanding of how he could use people in the future. So he still didn't, he could have put Bhai Meva Singh in jail for 10 years. He could have, but he didn't. He gave him a $27 fine, which is a lot better than 10 years in jail. And he said, don't worry, go ahead. The reason was because he thought if something happens down the line, I already have this network of spies. I did Bhai Meva Singh a favor, maybe Meva Singh will do me a favor. That was his reasoning behind it. So he lets Bhai Meva Singh Ji go. Then what happens is now Hopkinson's got this issue where Bhai Pag Singh, Bhai Balwant Singh, they're still out on the street, right? And they're still thorn in his side. So if he can't put them in jail, he can't deport them. Only way to get rid of them is to kill them. So what happens is Hopkinson's most trusted agent, Bela Singh Jion, who was known actually at the time as the, quote, best dressed Sikh in Vancouver. That's how they used to identify him, because he used to get paid so much money by the immigration department. So Bela had a horrible reputation in the community. What happened was they needed to get rid of Pag Singh. So Hopkinson made an agreement with Bela, and he said that you go and assassinate Pag Singh and Balwant Singh, and I'll get you out of jail. That was the agreement. So what happened is September 5th, 1914, the Kamagata Maru just went back a couple of months ago, right? So everything's kind of simmering down. There's a funeral at 2nd Avenue Gurdwara. Bhai Balwant Singh Ji and Bhai Pag Singh Ji are both there, and a bunch of the community members are there. Bela Jion comes into the Gurdwara Sahib. He has 2 revolvers. And inside the Gurdwara Sahib, he takes out both revolvers, and he shoots Bhai Pag Singh multiple times. He turns, and nearby there's another Gursikh who's also kind of involved in revolutionary activity. Bhai Badan Singh shoots him a few times. And then he turns around and he opens fire on the Sangat. And the Sangat starts running towards the door because they're trying to get safe. Some of them go and they eventually grab Bela. And what happens is in that moment, the reason that we know that Hopkinson made this agreement with them is Bela starts shouting while he's being taken away, talk to Mr. Hopkinson, he'll sort this out. He starts saying it in Punjabi. Hopkinson na gal karo, Hopkinson na gal karo. So he's saying this. He's claiming ownership of it. Then Bela's eventually taken to jail. Bhai Balwant Singh Ji at that time happened to be behind Tabia, so never got shot. Right? even though it was probably one of the targets there. Right before the shooting opened at the Gurdwara Sahib, there was a Kirtani doing Kirtan by the name of Bhai Bishan Singh Ji. Right before that Kirtani, Bhai Meva Singh Ji had been doing Kirtan. That's documented. Bhai Balwant Singh says that in his police report, that Bhai Meva Singh at that time was doing Kirtan. So Bhai Meva Singh is now a witness to what happened. Now when you read the newspapers from that time, pretty much the story that I've told you, they all more or less corroborate what happened, right? That Bela came in, shot everybody up, right? Injured 7 people, killed 2, and this is what happened. Then Bela's trial starts. All of a sudden, all these testimonies are coming out about how Bhag Singh and Badan Singh, who's the other Singh that got shaheed, attacked Bela. All of a sudden, everyone's testimony is changing. And the reason is because likely Hopkinson and Hopkinson's other agents were going around and they were threatening people and bribing people to change their testimony. And one of the people that was there that day, that saw everything that happened, was Bhai Meva Singh Ji. And Bhai Meva Singh was approached by Hopkinson's agents. His name was Babu. Pretty good name for an agent. Oye, Babu. But they had this altercation in downtown Vancouver where Babu went up to him and he said that when you testify in the trial, because he was a witness, he said, make sure you give testimony in favor of Bela Singh, or what we did to Bhag Singh, we'll do to you as well. That was a threat he was given. And he was given threats at other times as well with Hopkinson and all these things. Everyone's threatening Bhai Meva Singh that you have to lie in favor of Bela. Now, here's Bhai Meva Singh's situation now. On one side, we've seen already Sache Gursikh, right? Even when they were involved in revolutionary activities, still jhoot nahi bolya. Said everything straight up. If he tells the truth at this trial, when 17 other people, however many other people, have already said the exact opposite, probably won't hold much weight, right? And there's a threat on him as well. If he goes in there and he lies, he pretty much goes against the community and all of his principles, right? And to show you actually very quickly how principled Bhai Meva Singh Ji was, just how principled Bhai Meva Singh Ji was, when all this was before all this happened in September, and everyone already didn't like Bela and Babu and all the other agents, Meva Singh went out to Bela and Babu, and this is documented. This is, again, Canadian government archives. This is documented that Bhai Meva Singh tried to get Bela and Babu to stop going to the immigration department. He's like, I'll pay for your ticket back to India. I'll give you real estate. I'll set up a meeting with Bhag Singh and Balwant Singh. He offers them all these things. He's like, let's just stop fighting with each other and let's all start to get along again. That's the kind of character Bhai Meva Singh Ji had. Before this point, they had done everything, even just being an everyday Gursikh, done everything to try to bring ekta within everybody. But Rahuvichar, we come back to this. When Bhai Meva Singh, the day of Bhai Meva Singh's trial comes, the testimony comes, Hopkinson is supposed to give testimony on the same day. That day, October 21st, 1914, Bhai Meva Singh Ji walks into the Vancouver Provincial Courthouse, takes out 2 revolvers that they had in their long coat, and shoots Hopkinson several times until Hopkinson falls down and dies. Now, remember when Bela killed Jathedar Bhag Singh and Bhai Badan Singh Ji, that he turned around and opened fire on the Sangat? What did Bhai Meva Singh Ji do? Bhai Meva Singh Ji was caught by the janitor, the custodian rather, of the courthouse, and they struggled a little bit, but then they put down their guns and they started shouting. They started shouting, I shoot, I go station. Those are the words, I shoot, I go station. Because Bhai Meva Singh didn't really know English. So likely, probably rehearsed lines. They're saying, I shot Hopkinson, take me to the police station. And that's what happens. They go to the police station, and if you read the news reports, this is amazing. They're reading Bhai Meva Singh's charges back to Bhai Meva Singh. Bhai Meva Singh starts laughing at the officer that's reading the charges to him. They take Bhai Meva Singh into prison. Bhai Meva Singh is pacing back and forth in their jail cell, singing kirtan. They're singing shabds. And one time, an officer comes and tries to talk to him. Said the only time he stopped singing was when he turned to this officer and started yelling at him in English that no one could understand. But the only thing that anyone could understand was that he was saying something about the British. So, Birras and Namras. Okay, that's what I'm saying. So Bhai Meva Singh is in jail. They're rushed to trial October 30th in a very quick trial where the defense presents no witnesses. Bhai Meva Singh Ji is sentenced to death. The only thing that Bhai Meva Singh retaliates with, to the crown calls all these witnesses. The only thing Bhai Meva Singh gives back is one prepared 11 or 12 page testimony where they said, I did it, this is why I did what I did. And basically everything I've told you today lays that out, right? And said Hopkinson was the reason that we have had no rest in this country. That I was basically cutting off the head of the snake. So by their own admission, Bhai Meva Singh Ji has assassinated Hopkinson, is sentenced to death. January 11th, 1915, in U.S. Minster, Bhai Meva Singh Ji in the provincial jail is hanged at 8 a.m. and it becomes shaheed. Every January, or in the early part of every year since 1915, Bhai Meva Singh Ji's Shahidi has been commemorated by the community. The first documented time wasn't the year after, it was actually 1917, when the first time at Fraser Mills Gurdwara, where Bhai Meva Singh Ji's Antam Sanskar happened, where their funeral happened, they had the first Shahidi Smagam in memory of Bhai Meva Singh Ji. They also in Stockton, California, where they had a Gurdwara Sahib. They had an Akhand Path Sahib in memory of Bhai Meva Singh Ji, celebrating Bhai Meva Singh Ji Shahidi. Bhai Meva Singh actually wrote, before giving Shahidi, wrote a letter to the Sangat of Stockton. The English translation of that is still available today, kind of talking about like their experience and asking everyone not to cry for them, right? But to celebrate that now they've had the chance to do this incredible seva. That's Bhai Meva Singh Ji's story. Up until this year, every year, Gurdwara Sahibs in Vancouver celebrate Bhai Meva Singh Ji's Shahidi. And it's really seen as the moment that brought peace for the community. There still was activity that continued. Immigration decreased rapidly after that. It already started decreasing after 1906 when there was 5,000 people. Come 1919, there's somewhere between 250 and 800 people left in Canada of South Asian descent, and that's it. Only 250 or 800, because once you can't call your family, you can't really establish yourself here. You can't live in peace. A lot of people end up going back. In the 1920s, family reunification starts and it goes very slowly until the 1960s, until more migration started. That's when a lot of the Gurdwara Sahibs in Toronto and communities in like Calgary, even though there were early Sikhs here as well and in Calgary and places like that, but really that's when the community starts to pick up in those kind of areas. It's a really like, I could talk about this forever. I think that's pretty obvious, right? But I think it's a really, for myself, the reason I'm so attached to this history is because it's very easy to go to Chamkaur Sahib and think about Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj and think about the Shaheeds, right? But when you think about the revolution that is Sikhi, right? The revolution that was Gurbani, right? Allowing the Guru to like transcend space and travel across the entire world. I think how incredible is it that someone who lived in a neighborhood not too far from mine, someone who read the same Bani that I get to read today, someone who goes to the same Gurdwara Sahibs went to the same Gurdwara Sahibs that I get to go to today, that a few blocks down from my house, that their blood was spilled for the same cause, for the same Guru. And that to me is an incredibly inspirational thing. Before ending off, I did have a next part, but I'm just going to skip it. I'm going to skip this part. I want to say this. This is really important. Remember that Singh Comrade thing I said before, right? This has become a very contentious thing over the last 100 years. Sikhs, by virtue of whether it's because of marginalization in India and like kind of our relationship with the wider South Asian community there or the Indian community there, whether it's like stubbornness, who knows? People like to claim ownership of this history, right? People love to say, Gadar party is Sikhan di party. The Gadar party Sikhan ne banaiya, right? People like to say that, no, Gadar party was secular and it's all about secular. It's not that clear cut. The Gadar party was a secular party. I'll say this to you now. The Gadar party was a secular party and all of their ideals, they're secular. But they mobilized people through their faith. They mobilized people through their caste. They mobilized people through their socioeconomic status, right? And people were really like with one another, in order to make that happen. So I want to mention the people who weren't Sikhs, who had just a big part to play. Tarakanath Das was one of the earliest people. He's the one who found who Sant Teja Singh was and brought them down. Babu Harnam Singh, I said Jathedar Pag Singh, by Balwant Singh, and the third person that got arrested at Sumas. I said Bellingham, it was Sumas. Babu Harnam Singh, he was not a Sikh. Hussain Rahim, he wasn't even a Muslim. He changed his name to a Muslim name, but he came from, we're not even sure what background. But it was kind of a way, one, to hide his identity, but also to show solidarity across religious lines. Sorn Singh Pakna, who everyone thinks it's a Khalsa Sikh, but was actually a Namtari and was the first president of the Ghadar party. These people were all together. Pandit Sonlal Pathak. Sonlal was one of the people that was arrested as a co-conspirator with Bhai Meva Singh ji. Amanat Ali Khan did a lot to establish connections from California all the way to Vancouver for a lot of the early revolutionaries. Muhammad Akbar used to own a grocery store, which doesn't sound like a revolutionary thing, I realize as it comes out of my mouth, but also was one of the people who was on the Kamagata Maru Shore Committee, who took the responsibility of fundraising and protecting the passengers of the Kamagata Maru when it was in the harbor of Vancouver. Without these people, there's no history. And if we insist on saying that, Sikhani sara kuch kita, Sikhani sara kuch kita, where does that get us? It doesn't give us anything, right? The stories we share today, these things aren't diminished if other communities had a hand in them. I think they're just further beautified, right? That's like if someone came out and started telling you that all of Guru Gobind Singh Ji's army was Sikh. It's factually incorrect, right? We know for a fact that it wasn't entirely Sikh, which is one of the things that makes it so incredible. So I think that moment of sharing is really important. Also, I want to say that it's not just the South Asian community, but the Chinese, Japanese, and indigenous communities. Admittedly, we don't know as much about relationships with the indigenous communities, but we know that without those valuable intercultural relationships between marginalized peoples, we wouldn't have been able to put up the fights that we did put. And with that, if you're interested in learning more about this history, there's a bunch of stuff you can look at. The books that I'll recommend to you if you want to write them down. This is in Punjabi, but there's an English translation. Canada de Gadri Yode by Professor Son Singh Purni. I mentioned him earlier. A history book, it's a really bad title. A history book of the Sikhs in Canada and California by Dr. Mahinder Singh Tillon. Was written in the 80s. Dr. Mahinder Singh did a really incredible job of sitting down with families of early Sikhs, early South Asians, and talking to them and getting their stories. Voyage of the Kamagata Maru by Professor Hugh Johnston. If you want to learn about the Kamagata Maru, read this book. It's that simple. Professor Hugh Johnston has done an incredible job. It's like the seminal text on the Kamagata Maru. And he's done an incredible job of supporting everybody that's continued this research as well. Jewels of the Killa, also by Professor Hugh Johnston, is really good for getting a really personal story of that time period and all the stuff that was going on. Canadian Sikhs Part 1 by Gyanik Isar Singh. You can't find this in stores, but if you go to kamagataMaruJourney.ca, you might want to write that down if you're interested, kamagataMaruJourney.ca. The book's digitized on there. It's amazing. Gyanik Isar Singh also did a lot of work where he went out and talked to people, found handwritten documents. And the last one's a bit of a shameless plug. It's the Nameless Collective podcast, if you're familiar with it. It's two of my colleagues and I, Dr. Milind Singh and Naveen Gurn. And it's produced by Jugni Style Magazine. And it's just about early South Asian history in Vancouver. Season 2 is dropping soon. I don't know. I mean, the Experience Sikhi podcast coming out too. So I'm not trying to take away from that. But if you're interested, season 1's out there. It kind of goes over this. A lot more nuance, a lot more detail. It's a little bit more of a step back approach, right? So it's not so Sikh-centric, but we all come from similar but different backgrounds. So we have a chance to talk about that. And with that, I just realized something. This is for the organizers. So I'm gonna take 2 more minutes. The last thing I want to talk about was just a few days ago, last week. Gurdwara Sahib Sukh Sagar, Khalsa Diwan Society, New Westminster, celebrated its 100th anniversary. It was one of the first Gurdwara Sahibs as well. It was under the Khalsa Diwan Society umbrella. And so on March 4th, we just celebrated its 100th anniversary. And it was really rather incredible. But so I talked to the Gurdwara Sikhs, and we published this 30 ish page pamphlet about the Gurdwara Sahib's history in English and Punjabi. We have 60 copies here today. They're free, so if you're gonna read them, please take one. If you're not gonna read it, I don't think there's enough for everyone, so please don't take one. But so if you're interested in the history of this Gurdwara Sahib, I'm gonna talk about it a little bit. But should I talk about it? Okay, 2 more minutes. Khalsa Diwan Sahib in Westminster, it's a particularly close story for me because this is the Gurdwara Sahib that I got married at. It's the Gurdwara Sahib closest to my home. It's located on unceded ancestral territory of the Kakite Nation. That's the indigenous community that was situated where it's what we could now call New Westminster. It was started by 2 Gursikhs by the name of Baba Bishan Singh Ji and Sant Baba Sundar Singh Ji Canadian. That was their name, Sant Baba Sundar Singh Ji Canadian. That's what everyone calls them. Baba Bishan Singh Ji, Bhai Bishan Singh was a great Gursikh. First was one of the committee members of the Gurdwara Sahib in Victoria. And the first time we ever know about Bhai Bishan Singh Ji and Sant Baba Sundar Singh Ji meeting was when Sant Teja Singh Ji came to Vancouver, was doing their Prachar mission. And Sant Teja Singh Ji took a jatha of 5 Singhs from Vancouver to Victoria. And in that jatha was Sant Baba Sundar Singh Ji. Bhai Bishan Singh Ji was at that time on the committee of Victoria Gurdwara Sahib. So it's likely a time where the two of them probably met for the first time. Or it's the first time we have. We know that they were both involved in Prachar a lot back then. Really, like Sant Baba Sundar Singh Ji, Canadian, is what they're known as now. I think a lot of people, or some people in here at least, you know about Gyani Bhagwan Singh Ji, Baba Bhagwan Singh, Pindra, right? They're from Talleal, the Pind. So they were raised by Sant Baba Karnail Singh Ji. Sant Baba Karnail Singh Ji came under Sant Baba Lal Singh Ji Barakat. And before Sant Baba Lal Singh Ji Barakat was Sant Baba Sundar Singh Ji Canadian. So the dera that they started there, or the Gurdwara Sahib they started there, you all have a connection to that if you know who Gyani Bhagwan, if you have a relationship with Gyani Bhagwan Singh. But I want to tell you about Sant Baba Sundar Singh because I love Sant Baba Sundar Singh. So always known as a very spiritual figure. They worked in the mills as well. They left that job to start doing Sikhi Prachar and just kind of joined the Sikhi mission in Vancouver. What happened was Bhai Bishan Singh Ji, when Sant Baba Sundar Singh Ji was going around, called them to New West, that come to New West and do seva with us. So Sant Baba Sundar Singh Ji started coming to New West and doing Prachar there. And Baba Sundar Singh and Bhai Bishan Singh Ji became friends at that point. And they became very, very close. So much so that Sant Baba Sundar Singh, their parent back in India used to be Nathoke in Punjab. And Bhai Bishan Singh Ji was Talleal. But they were so close that everyone started calling Sant Baba Sundar Singh that Baba Sundar Singh Talleal. Because they're just so close. They're like brothers. So they started thinking they're from the same parent. Sant Baba Sundar Singh became the Granthi of Khalsa Diwan Society in New Westminster. And there's a lot of stories about like their spiritual experiences and like kind of how they were involved in the activism back then too. But the really beautiful story I love about these two Gursikhs is, so the Gurdwara Sahib started earlier. It started in about 1913. They got their first Sarup. But as early as 1911, they started doing programs in New Westminster, that city. So it's hard to pin down when exactly it started. But sometime after 1913, after the Sarup, and it became like known as the Gurdwara Sahib, Bhai Bishan Singh Ji got really sick. And Bhai Bishan Singh Ji had to go to the hospital to get a surgery, and they gave their life savings to Sant Baba of, I think it was $900. Again, adjust for how much that is, that's a lot of money. Gives it all to Sant Baba Sundar Singh Ji. And they tell Baba Sundar Singh that Je Pana Vart Gaya, if I don't come back from my surgery, that is sari maya Gurdwara Sahib vich la diyo, right? Just put this all towards the cause of the Gurdwara Sahib. And Sant Baba Sundar Singh Ji is like, theek hai. And Bhai Bishan Singh Ji goes for surgery, and Baba Sundar Singh Ji takes the money and spends it. But they spend it all for the Gurdwara Sahib. Bhai Bishan Singh Ji's surgery is a success. So Bhai Bishan Singh Ji comes back, and they're like, Maharaj, Maya, and they're like, Maharaj, Lati. And so Baba Sundar Singh spent all of Bhai Bishan Singh Ji's life savings into the Gurdwara Sahib. And let's take a moment to let that resonate and think about if someone spent our life savings without our permission into something while we're still alive and we still have a life to save for, how we might react. Bhai Bishan Singh ji was, they were pure khush si. And they're like, ek din ta lagne si. They're like, at this time the Gurdwara Sahib needed the seva, changa ho gaya ki as mauke te lag gaye paise. So that's the kind of jeevan Sant Baba Sundar Singh and Bhai Bishan Singh ji had. Baba Sundar Singh also has this real, okay, I'm gonna tell you another story. I'm gonna keep going. मैं Vancouver to आया. I love the story of Baba Sundar Singh, okay? Because it's hilarious, it's dharmic, it's spiritual, it's got all the fixins. So Sant Baba Sundar Singh, there's a river that goes all the way up BC. It's called the Fraser River. BC is pretty much built around the Fraser River. All the settlements all the way up to northern BC is all built around the Fraser River, and it goes through Vancouver and US to all the shahars. So Sukhsagar Gurdwara Sahib is very close to the Fraser. So one day, Baba Sundar Singh, again, amazing jivan, and they go to the bank of Fraser River, and Ode Kanare, they sit down, Chaunkada Lake, and they start doing abhyas, they start meditating, they start doing simran. They close their eyes and they go into samadhi, right? So in complete, absolute ecstasy, they go into samadhi, unaware of their physical presence in the world, or detached rather from their physical presence in the world. And what happens is, it's Canada. It starts snowing. And it starts snowing, and these kids are walking home from school, and they see a guy, like these Gore kids, and they see a guy sitting there, and there's snow piled up on top of him, right? And they freaked out. And they see him, he's got a dardi, he's got the star, so they run to the Gurdwara Sahib, and they're like, Otte thoda Baba jammya pya, I don't know, right? They're like, something's going on, right? Your old man's frozen over there. They weren't old then, but they're like, the guy's frozen over there. And so the Singhs were like, oh my God, they ran over and they saw Baba and they picked him up, they took him to the hospital, right? Baba is madhi the whole time. Take him to the hospital, right? They go to Royal Columbian Hospital in Westminster. Baba is down, they got like the Tara Tura and whatever it is. A little while later, Baba comes out of samadhi, and they look and they're like on this bed, and they got all these pipes and tubes in them. And they're like, Aki. And the Gursikhs are like, oh, Baba, yasi ta socha, pata nahi pana vart gaya, pata nahi ki ho gaya, right? And they're like, Gore, nang desi, this and that. And Baba ji started laughing, and and often if you read Baba Sundar Singh's Jeevan, even when they go back to Punjab, it's always a lot of this, where something funny happens. I call it like a Sutra Shah model, where something funny happens, and then the lesson comes afterwards. Funny or weird, sometimes it's weird. And they come, and they started laughing, and they said that this would be like dunya da eh hal hoya pya, right? Like jeda marya hua banda, right? That has no consciousness, their conscience is dead, right? And they're maya piche pukha marya firda, right? And he's running after money. We say that person, we look to them and they say they're full of life, right? And the person who's detached from this world and attached to the true wealth, right? The namtan, that's attached to the masti of Akal Purkh, be like, we look at that person, we think that they're dead. And like that's the world that we live in today. But that's my favorite story about Baba Sundar Singh. But yeah, so that's so if you're interested, the whole history of the Gurdwara Sahib on a very high level, like just glimpses of it. There's 60 pamphlets. If you're interested, please do take one. I brought them for this. And it goes from 1911, when the community first started there, all the way to present day. And there's a lot of famous intersections, like a couple of students of Sant Gyani Guru Bhajan Singh Ji used to be the Granthi there. If you're familiar with Singh Sahib, Gyani Mani Singh used to be the Granthi, who used to be Granthi at Darbar Sahib, was simultaneously the Granthi at New West Gurdwara, so it was pretty funny how he used to go back and forth. And Gyani Sujan Singh was another one who used to be a student of Sant Gyani Guru Bhajan Singh. So some interesting things there. It also goes into the history of Bhai Meva Singh Ji a little bit, because of their Shahidi specifically, because that's the city that Bhai Meva Singh Ji gave Shahidi in. So if you're interested, we'll have that as well. I've spoken for a very long time. My throat's hurting. I'm sure your ears are hurting. I thank you for your patience. I ask your forgiveness and Akal Purkh Maharaj Guru Sahib's forgiveness for all the mistakes that I've definitely made. And I think if there's time, I guess we'll do a question and answer period. But in case there's not, we'll just say Fateh now. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. There's time? Hanji. Sharing questions, whatever you like.
Yeah, if you have a question, we'll just hand up the mic.
Hi there. Thank you very much for this presentation. I really appreciate it. I have a quick question I want to ask. So I know from my history back in those days is very racist, especially for different ethnic communities to establish their place of residence. It was really difficult because a lot of groups thought of the major white community didn't like them being there. So what were some of the issues of trying to establish a gurdwara in Vancouver at that time?
Oh, that's an amazing question. I put the slide back up in case you forgot about the racism.
Oh, sorry, I can lay you.
No, not you, everyone else. Just remember, everybody, racism. It's a thing. There definitely were issues. It's great that you brought it up. So we've heard stories about thanks, Baba. We've heard stories about like the challenges that came specifically with the Gurdwara Sahib. So it's all wood paneling, right? If you look at it over here, it's all wood paneling. So what ended up happening is we've heard stories from Abbotsford Gurdwara Sahib, which is still standing. It's the oldest standing Gurdwara Sahib in North America, as well as this one where the mill workers, the Sikh mill workers, would work an extra day. So they'd also work the 7th day on Sunday, and instead of getting paid, they also get paid in lumber. And so they just take a piece of lumber and then working one person for one piece of lumber per day, per week. They got the lumber because white people wouldn't sell them lumber. We've also heard stories, and this is a story I've only heard like Sina Basina, right, oral tradition, which is from a family who says that their grandfather was involved in building 2nd Avenue Gurdwara here. And again, white people would not sell them lumber. White people would not sell them tools. So they'd have to buy it off indigenous communities. And at that time, the indigenous populations that were working with them were where Surrey is now, which is back then quite a distance. So they'd go on horse and cart to Surrey, and they'd buy their lumber and tools off of indigenous peoples, and then come back and then use those materials. So there definitely was that element of it. And then even the politics of establishing a Gurdwara Sahib, I think, were not lost on the community at that time, right? They say, like, it's not like well documented, but every time a Gurdwara Sahib opened, there was pretty much a Nagar Kirtan with it. So like it was very much this thing about claiming space and making it known that we're here, and also an invitation to invite the community in. I think that we see that, like, because there were a few white converts back then into Sikhi, that we see that invitation of like welcome them into your space. So challenges there definitely was on the side of on the physical building part. In terms of acquiring permits and stuff like that, I'm not sure if there was. I'm not sure. Once they bought the land, I don't know how they leased it or licensed it. There would have been that battle as well. But there was also the Battle of Erasure, right? Which was happening quite intentionally. So if you look at the phone directories at the time, if you look at any phone directory after 1908, after the Gurdwara Sahib's built, and you look at this neighborhood, look at 2nd Avenue, and you'll see if there's a white person's house, it'll be their name, right? Like F. Scott and G. Fitzgerald and whatever, this and that. And they'd have everyone's names. But if it's any migrant community living in that house, it'll say, it won't even say an appropriate term, right? If it's a Chinese person, it'll say the racialized term of Chinaman. If it's a Japanese person, it'll say the racialized term of Jap. If it's a South Asian person, it'll say the racialized term of Hindu. And so if you look at it, we actually, if we don't have the records of whose houses they were and who owned them, we don't know who lived in what houses on this block because they refuse to document it, right? They're like, the white people matter, right? Here's, you probably want to know where the white people are, and this is just other people who have more pigment in their skin. So there's definitely that challenge as well. I don't think that's... Communication system test. Sorry. I don't... Communication system test. Okay. Okay. Rule of threes, I figured it'd come again. That's as much insight I can put on that.
Thank you for answering. I really appreciate it.
Back.
Is there any stories of, particular stories of solidarity between the Sikh community and the indigenous community from that time period that's documented?
Documented, that's always the key word, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of these things, I mean, with so much indigenous culture being, many of indigenous cultures being orally based, and same with so many South Asian cultures, a lot of stuff travels just through living histories, right, of peoples. The two that I've heard most prominently was that one about the building of the Gurdwara. The other one that I've heard is, so when the Kamagara Maru was out in Burrard Inlet, the South Asian community was not allowed to get in boats and go visit, right? Conversely, the white community on Sundays, they would do this thing where they would like rent boats as families, and they'd circle around, like the paddle boats, and they'd circle around the Kamagara Maru, and like they'd show their kids like they're like zoo animals or something, and like they'd laugh at them and shout racial slurs. It's horrible. Like I said, so much racism. But in that time, when the Kamagara Maru was out there, we've heard stories of the Chinese, Japanese, and indigenous community, where indigenous communities would go out in canoe in the middle of the night from Stanley Park, if you know where Stanley Park is, off the other side of Burrard Inlet, and like the South Asian community would stack them up with food because the government wasn't meeting their quota of how much they needed to feed these people. So they stacked them up with food, and then they'd row out in the middle of the night to provide the passengers with food. So I've heard that about the Chinese, Japanese, and indigenous communities. Specific examples are really hard. It's a problematic history always. Like it's like I said, if you look at the history of the word taika as well, it's problematic. It's not like there definitely was this shift in like while it's trying to establish or trying to claim space in this world, where you start kind of seeking for the affirmation of the oppressor, right? And then like the easiest common denominator to separate yourself from is indigenous peoples, and the South Asian community is not exempt from that by any means. Like we were part of that system, but like it's hard to find specific examples. One thing I will say, the community of Williams Lake, BC, because a lot of the times I've heard in other small towns of BC where it's like there was contentious relationships between South Asian community and indigenous community. I will say the people of Williams Lake have told me that it was always the Punjabi community and the indigenous community that got along the best out of everyone else. So that's like a nice little feel-good story. But it would be wrong of me to suggest that there's like tons of examples. When one, I couldn't say that based on documentation, and two, it could possibly just be out of my breadth of knowledge too.
Okay. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you.
I got a question for you. You know, the saying goes that one person's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. What was the perception of Paimeva Singhji in the 1911s, and how did that change up to now?
Okay, that's a great question. William Hopkinson today, if you go to the border crossings, like the internal offices, I haven't been there, but I have seen pictures from inside. You can't go inside unless you work there. I've seen pictures, but in the wall of fallen soldiers, one of the patches that of fallen officials that's there is William Hopkinson's patch. When I think maybe in Ottawa as well, but I know in Peace Arch border, when each year when they name federal officials who've fallen in the line of duty, William Hopkinson's name is still said. So there's this quiet legacy of him still being honored as a hero, right? Just because it's kind of gone unchecked for a long time. And sometimes overtly. This is a really weird but cool story. In 1987, I don't know if you're all familiar with the refugee boat that came from India in 87 to Nova Scotia. A lot of that population came to Surrey, right? I think some of them might have come out here to Ontario as well. But there was one man who's some white dude, I forget his name, which is probably a good thing. I don't need to remember it. Who was so anti-immigration and granting asylum for these peoples, he established a society called the William Hopkinson Society, and then came to Ottawa to campaign against these Sikh refugees to land in Vancouver. Anyway, to land in Nova Scotia. That's just an aside. That's Hopkinson's legacy. Paimeva Singh's legacy is in an interesting place right now. If you're ever interested, like do a Meva Singh search on like cbc.ca, and like, because 2015, a lot of commemoration events and things that have happened around then, and look at the comments. I know comment sections are garbage by default, but if you look at it, there's so much deflection and so much like casual everyday racism that continues, right? Like, in one article I remember it said, okay, yeah, Meva Singh might have been okay, but like Sikhs bombed Air India, right? Like people just throw it out willy-nilly, like false equivalencies. People also say, why are we even talking about this? It's a moot point. He's a murderer. It's an interesting time right now. So like, I don't think Bhai Meva Singh's ever been regarded en masse in the media as like someone we can talk about with a Louis Riel type of narrative, right? Where it's like, maybe you agree, maybe you don't agree, right? Let's talk about it. I know for a lot of us out in Vancouver that we're trying to like facilitate that conversation. It's like, I'm not gonna go into, like, I've gone to a lot of high school classrooms. I'm not gonna go in there and start doing Bhai Meva Singh Zindabad Nare, right? And I don't want them to start doing that either. But what I want them to do is to open up their history book and ask themselves why there's one page of the entire textbook that's devoted to the Kamagata Maru and just that one, right? And why is that the only context in which brown people are mentioned at all? Those are the questions we want them to ask. And in that, let's unpack these narratives as well. That's the work that like a lot of people are trying to do now, especially like once that apology came through for the Kamagata Maru in 2016, 15, 16, what, 16, whatever, 2016. Now that there's been an apology, I think we have the onus to say that, not the onus, but we have the right to say that, okay, if you're apologizing for this event, you're admitting wrongdoing. So let's take all these people that we've labeled as wrongdoers and let's re-examine them as well, right? If they were doing wrong against wrong, does that make them right? Like, does that, let's have those conversations. But like by and large, it's hard to have the Bhai Meva Singh conversation outside of the South Asian community. One thing I'm seeing now though, is I'm seeing a diversity of opinion within the South Asian community. Like, well, people will be like, well, I'm a pacifist, so I'm not okay with this, right? Which is cool. I think it's okay for people to have that opinion. I don't think you have to agree with what Bhai Meva Singh ji did. But we're seeing the diversity of opinion there. And I just think because the thing with a lot of like marginalized stories is because they don't get that attention, we don't get to get into the nuance of them, right? Like we're kind of stuck talking about the Kamagata Maru because that's the amount of time that they're going to give us, right? They only care to listen to the big events. They only care when we're on the front page. But there's so much in there that matters to us that are the stories of who we are and make up what our community is. Bhai Meva Singh is a huge one of them. It's like we have a celebration every year of someone who Canada regards as a criminal, as a murderer, right? As one of the only 2 executions that took place at that jail. Like it's like he was hanged by the most prolific hangman Ellis in Canadian history. Like there's a lot of intersections into bigger conversations, and if we're not allowed to have those conversations, we're never going to get past he was the capital M murderer and the conversation's done. It's like, well, you need to let us have these conversations. So I think on our side, like, it's really just, it's until people know about it, they're not going to talk about it. And that's kind of like the approach that I take. This was a very Sikh presentation. I have a much more thoroughly documented and like footnoted and annotated one for when I'm presenting in different spaces because I'm aware of what I'm presenting. I'm presenting murder and I'm saying, I think this was fine. And a lot of us every year say over and over again, this was fine. And if you're just not gonna have that conversation with us, it's never gonna change. I think that's what it is. So it just really hasn't been talked about for the last at least 50 years. Sorry, I was all over the map there.
There is an article in social media about the early establishment of the Sikhs in Canada, and they are talking about the very first group who stepped on in Canada, like the group of 20-30 Sikhs from Hong Kong, and the only one person knew English. There was Arjun Singh. Any detail about Arjun Singh? And he was instrumental about getting them jobs and then bringing another set of like around 1,500 Sikhs from Punjab and get them jobs.
It's so I have to approach this in 2 ways. One, I have to caveat that I'm a community historian. I'm not I dropped out of university. Like I don't have a degree even. I went to film school, but like I dropped out of university for history. Like I'm not an accredited historian. My thing usually my research is what interests me, and shapes my world outlook, and also on a ruhaniyat side, it's what nourishes my soul. So I like a lot of this stuff, like I'm not, like I haven't taken much interest in, so I couldn't speak authoritatively about it. I have to admit that. That being said, I haven't heard about an Arjun Singh with the first 36, the Hong Kong regiment. I've heard about a Kesar Singh that's come in that time. And so it's really hard to definitively say that this was the first this was the first that, because it does get a little bit lost in a lot of the documentation. Was weird back then. It was worse, right? Back then, when you write down someone's ethnicity, you could write Indian, you could write Asian, you could write Hindu, you could write Sikh, you could write anything. So there's so much lost to documentation that we might never know about. So it's hard to say definitively this is the first thing. That being said, before the Hong Kong regiment, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that in Golden, BC, which is up north, that in 1880 there was Sikhs and a Gurdwara. There's a lot of evidence to suggest it. It can't be definitively said, not by me anyway, maybe someone who's done more research into it. But by Arjun Singh, that one, I don't know who that was. The only Bhai Arjun Singh I know from that very early time was an amazing Gursikh by the name of Arjun Singh Malik. And Bhai Arjun Singh brought the first Sarup of Guru Granth Sahib Ji to Canada. He did a huge seva, very active in the community. And he was one of the first people here in 1904. He brought the first Sarup, but he was also one of the first people to pass away. And he passed away even before the first Gurdwara was built. I know he was very much a leader in the community. That's the only Arjun Singh I could tell you about. I'm sorry about that.
I had two questions. They're two separate questions. The first one was about by Meva Singh Ji. I might have missed that part, but I thought he was sentenced for life. And why was he hung?
So he was sentenced for death. Like he was sentenced to death.
For death.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
okay.
so he was sentenced on October 30th.
Yeah.
And he was hanged on January 11th.
Okay, and then also you also mentioned how Bibi Harnam Kaur and Bibi Kartar Kaur were brought into Vancouver as an act of grace. When was it that women or other South Asian community members were allowed to come into Canada?
So 1920s.
How did that come about?
Yeah, so I don't know the details of it. One of my colleagues, she does an incredible amount of research into this. And so she knows the nitty gritty. I can tell you on a high level that in the 1920s, family reunification started. And over the years, the immigration opened up more and more. I can also tell you that in the 1910s, based two more times, two more women whose names I'm not sure about. I haven't been able to track down. One was the wife of Bahira Singh Ji, and one was, and I forget who, one was the mother of, and we have her name, I'm just slipping in my mind at the moment, mother of a man named, I think, Hakam Singh. They were also allowed in that same time period as an act of grace. So, and then there were potentially women there before that we just don't know about, or we don't know how they got in, or kind of like, it's really blurry, just lack of documentation. Also, that's an understandable lack of documentation, because if you have someone there that shouldn't be there, you probably don't want to draw attention to it, right? So like a survival thing again. That's just my hypothesis. But that's what I can tell you about that time, is that there's a couple of other acts of grace up till 1919. And in 1919, 1920s, family reunification started. And I think my inclination is to say, and don't quote me on this, and I apologize for not having more information about this, but my inclination is to say that the population dwindled down to such a small amount that it was like, okay, that these people are staying, and it's time to get, like, it's not time to give them a spot at the negotiation table, but it's time to start like just dealing with those issues as they are, right? Instead of like this bigger conspiracy of let's get rid of them all. Yeah, sorry, that's all I have about that. Yeah. So this for me is interest work, but it like so as like professionally, I'm a filmmaker and playwright. So a lot of like Sikh and South Asian history inspires the work that I do. Usually in the diaspora specifically, but that's kind of the professional side of it. I have to say one thing, okay? I love you all that experience Sikhi. You've been so amazing to me, and you've done so many great things. I have to complain about this for a second, okay? Can we all, if you have one of these, if you don't have one, don't get one. I'm sorry, you don't get one. Let me tell you why. Because this was an interview I did with a theater, and y'all just copy and pasted it and put it on there. It barely relates to the talk. So I wasn't thrilled about this one. Not because of the content. The content was fine, but it was an interview. And in the interview's context, I said, I also like to make a lot of jokes, usually when I shouldn't be making jokes. I would not put that in my bio. I'm sorry. Like, that is the weirdest thing for me to put in my bio. So I just want to make it clear that they didn't ask me, can you tell us about experience Sikhi? And I'm like, I like to make jokes. Like, that was not what was happening there. I needed to say that, just to clear my name. Okay, so what got me into it was, it started when I was young. So I read The Voyage of the Kamagadamaroo by Hugh Johnston when I was 10. I didn't understand it. It's not meant for 10-year-olds. But it was this really interesting thing where I would read a chapter, which I didn't understand any of because super academic. And I'd go to my mom, and then I'd be like, what was this about? And then she'd tell me the story of the Kamagadamaroo, which I really appreciated because like I got an oral history telling of it, which I very much preferred, before like an academic study of it. So that's where it started from. Kamagadamaroo was always like in my life from when I was about like 10 years old. And by Meva Singh Ji too. And then when I was a teenager, and I heard about Pai Meva Singh Ji again in passing, and I heard about like their funeral, and like there's a Nagar Kirtan that happened from where they gave Shahidi to the sthan where their Antam Sanskar happened. I was like, oh, I want to know about that. And I heard that the New Westminster Quay is where it was. It wasn't, but that's what I heard. So when I was like 16, 17, I had no inclination that like, oh, he's regarded as a murderer, right? That there's not going to be anything here to honor him on a city property. But I remember just going up and down frantically down like the boardwalk and being like, there must be some kind of monument to Pai Meva Singh Ji here. And there wasn't. Years later, I learned I was looking in the wrong place. But then also, like, I just didn't understand the politics of it completely. And then really it came up again just like organically when I was older in my 20s. And one of your semi-locals now, I think who you refer to as Gyani Gurkirat Singh Ji. But so Gurkirat Singh and I were good friends, and we were just talking about Pai Meva Singh Ji, and like, and then we're like, you know, this all happened here, and we had no kind of idea of how to do archive research or any of that, and we're like, this stuff must have been in the papers. So we went downtown Vancouver to Vancouver Public Library, and we pulled out like microfilm. I don't know if you ever done microfilm research, it's annoying, but it's also pretty satisfying. Like, the machine's kind of fun. But then we just pulled out microfilm and we started looking. And that's the first time that at that time I read the newspaper article that said Pai Meva Singh was in his jail cell. And then it said like singing praises, right? Like it talked about him singing kirtan, and it just shook my world. And I was like, I never thought that I would be reading about a Sikh in Vancouver singing kirtan in jail who's about to give Shahidi 100 years ago, a few blocks from my house, in Goria, the newspaper, right? And it shook me. And I was like, I didn't think I'd be reading about this incredible of a Gursikh from a different source, right? And that's where history's always kind of been like, I was fortunate to have learned from Pai Charanjit Singh Ji Taki, who taught here for a little while too. And Charanjit Singh used to say to me so much, that he's like tera kam launa itihas padhna, tera kam launa itihas padhna. And so that's always been with me, that I have to learn history. And he'd make me write things down and stuff too, and he'd make me memorize facts. And that's always been a thing, that I've had to memorize history from that time. And also from my mom, who's very like just reads everything. So my history's always been there. And then when I read this, there was something that just clicked with me, and really inspired me to become a better Sikh. And I had this thing I said at a talk at Guru Nanak Academy once, where I said, the pursuit of history without spiritual consequence is just to feed the ego, something like that. And I really believe that. As like, Everything is just for our ego, right? Until there's a adhyatmak pak to it, right? And then, so for me, it's like my work, my seva, but this history stuff, it's only beneficial as long as it's benefiting the community, and also benefiting my soul. And that for me, it nourished my soul, and I was like, I need to learn more about this. I became obsessed. That was like 7 years ago.
My question was in regarding to the contribution of like historical contribution of Mrs. Annie Wright or Bibi Lavgod. We didn't really touch on her too much. So can you just kind of go into detail about that?
Yeah, 100%. So I realized you said it in the beginning, and then it was a conscious decision actually. I'll tell you why I never talked about it, but I'm happy to talk about it because I love the story. The reason I didn't talk about it is just a couple of days ago was International Women's Day, right? And I was looking into, if you ever seen Meva Singh's Antam Sanskar photo, right before the funeral, before like it's lit and everything, there's a Bibi standing there. And she's identified by Gyani Kesar Singh as the wife of Pai Hira Singh. And I looked everywhere, and I found a bunch of newspapers and stuff, and all I found over and over again was Mrs. Hira Singh, Mrs. Hira Singh, Mrs. Hira Singh. And it just hit me, and I was like, as amazing as Annie Wright's story is, and I will share it now, I was like, today I want to focus on sharing the stories of Gursikh brown women, right? Whose stories too much we've erased. And people like the wife of Pai Hira Singh, who did pretty much exactly what Bibi Kartar Kaur and Bibi Harnam Kaur did, and we don't know her name. She was standing behind Bibi Harnam Kaur's body during her funeral. She was standing behind Pai Meva Singh's body during his funeral, and we don't know her name. And it was like, this is not right. So we need to be shedding as much light onto our Gursikh Bibiyan that came, the early ones, and did so much, and we lost their names to history. It's really important to me. So that's why I chose to go with Bibi Harnam Kaur, and then omit Annie Wright's. But I'll tell you about her. So the first Anand Karaj, I talked about it very briefly, was done by Sant Teja Singh Ji. So there was a man named Pai Mansha Singh. Pai Mansha Singh was taking English lessons, okay? He was taking English lessons from this woman named Annie Wright. And then they too decided that, I don't know, Bollywood moment, right? Pyar pe gaya, they wanted to get married, okay? And they got married in a church. Mansha Singh got baptized. He became Mansha Joseph Singh. And they got married. Sometime after, they met Sant Teja Singh Ji. And Sant Teja Singh had this incredible ability to do prachar to everyone, right? Because Punjabi, Hindi, English, it didn't matter. And then they were influenced by Sant Teja Singh Ji to become Gursikhs and then redo their whole life, like their whole union as Gursikhs. So that's what they did. Pai Mansha Singh dropped the name Joseph. He took Amrit. He got the name Gyan Singh. He still went by Mansha Singh, but he got the name Gyan Singh. Annie Wright took Amrit as well, and she was a widow. She was a widow, and from her first marriage, she had a daughter named Winnie. Winnie took Amrit as well. She became Prem Kaur. And then Annie Wright became Lav Kaur. And so Lav Kaur, Prem Kaur, Gyan Singh or Mansha Singh took Amrit in that sanchar with a few other people. And Sant Teja Singh, again, I love Sant Teja Singh. Just so smart about like identifying this is a big moment, right? It's really important. What he did is he got Annie Wright to write a chitti, right? He got her to write a letter to show that like this isn't a conversion that like, oh, I just want to marry this guy, I'm getting converted. That I'm a Sikh, this is what my life is going to be. I'm going to get up in the morning, I'm going to read these 5 Barniya, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, wrote the name of them, right? I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, all the way until the end of her life, like where it's like, if my husband and I are to die together, we would like to be cremated according to Sikh rites. And then that's what happened, right? So in 1920, Annie Wright passed away, Lav Kaur, she passed away from, I believe, a form of cancer. And Khalsa Diwan Society did her funeral. So it was at the Gurdwara Sahib and it was in the newspaper and everything. and so it's really interesting because they lived their lives as Sikhs after that for the rest of the time. Her daughter, Winnie, did not, I don't think. I think she got married to a Gora, moved to California or something like that. A glamorous lifestyle. But she did. And so the other really interesting thing about Annie Wright's story is this. So, Bibi Harnam Kaur passed away, right? 9 days after she gave birth to her daughter. And now Bhai Pag Singh's raising 2 children, Joginder Singh and Karam Kaur. Pag Singh gets shot at the Gurdwara Sahib a few months later and becomes Shaheed. They don't have parents anymore. Khalsa Diwan Society gets together, they have a meeting, and they're like, we have these 2 children, what should we do, right? When like Bibi Kartar Kaur's got her own kids to raise, Mataji, who's Hira Singh's wife, has her own children to raise. And Annie Wright, her daughter, Winnie, is older now, she's like 16. And so they decide, they're like, let's give Karam Kaur to Annie Wright. And so she raised, from 1914 to 1920, she raised Karam Kaur, Bhai Pag Singh and Bibi Harnam Kaur's daughter. After that, and that's really fascinating because you know how we always we hold Shaheed Parvar in such reverence, right? The families of Shaheeds. And we're like, we need to take care of them. They did such an amazing thing for our community, for our Panth. We need to take care of them. They had the same thing back then. So what happened was, if you look at the Khalsa Diwan Society meeting minutes, there's meeting notes about people arguing with each other, right? Because there's these Gursikhs from Victoria, and they're like, we want to pay for all of Pag Singh stuff, right? Karam Kaur stuff, we want to pay all her bills. And the society's like, no, we want to do it as a Sangat. And so like there's like 3 meetings, they go back and forth fighting who gets to pay to take care of the Shaheed Parvar, right? And it's a really beautiful thing. But and so in 1920, what happens is Karam Kaur is sent back to India. We don't know what happened to Joginder Singh. After Bhai Pag Singh becomes Shaheed, there's no mention of him in history. But Karam Kaur goes back to India. Then Annie Wright, and then she passed away in 1920, or 1921, 2, 3, around there. Yeah, so there you go.
Hi, again. My question's the same. I think you mentioned Annie Wright a couple of years ago. I just didn't know her name. At Sikh Heritage Month, when you showcased a scene of by Meva Singh play that you had written. And over there, and I just wanted to ask if like the legacy has continued, like if there's still like that family, if there's someone that like has preserved that history of their parents within that, like.
Yeah, with Annie Wright's family, when he moved down, I tried to track down her marriage and stuff. It didn't work. I could try again, but it'd be finding her family. But from what I know, because Mancha Singh got married again, and his son now, or grandson, I've talked to him on the phone a couple of times, and he's in his mid-80s. And he said that he had talked to Winnie a couple of times early on, but then they lost touch as well. So there's some stuff out there, some stuff I can't say. Subscribe to Nameless Collective Podcast. You'll get your answer.
I have a question. So you mentioned earlier that I guess the government and the white people at that time, they didn't allow for the South Asian community to buy lumber or tools and stuff. In terms of funeral rights, what challenges did they face with that?
That's a really good question. I don't know if you know or not, if this is like a loaded question, but funeral rights were a huge thing. They were like a big problem. And they always have been actually for Sikhs, all the way up to like the 90s, all over Canada. So with the funeral rights, it was contentious. So there was a committee made. One of them was by Varyam Singh, I believe, who was on the committee, who was one of the leaders of the time, and a few others. And their job was to try to just get funeral rights. So there's early pictures of early 1900s where it's just like a random park, and then there's like a funeral happening. And it's on the beach, like by the water, in Stanley Park. So there's not too much context around that. If you've ever been to Victoria, you know about, I always say it like the Desi way, Butchered Garden. What's it called? Bouchard? How do you pronounce it? Anyway, in Victoria, every Punjabi person can call it Butchered Garden. So the earliest funeral photograph is happening there, which is like very far from the city of Victoria. A lot of the times they're doing things on mills, right? Just sometimes on the record, sometimes off, and they're trying to fight to get rights, to get the funeral rights. The first funeral I know about, that I've seen photographs from, that followed the rites that I'd heard about, was Bibi Harnam Kaur's funeral. So Mountain View Cemetery, which is the biggest cemetery in Vancouver, not too far from where you live. So Mountain View Cemetery, what they did is they're like, okay, we'll give you a corner of like the furthest part of the lot, because their thing was they don't want people finding out about it. Because when Gore found out about it, they started complaining about it. And they start saying like, oh, it smells, this and that, blah, blah, blah. So they gave them the stipulation that you can do it on the corner part of this, of Mountain View Cemetery. But you have to have boards that are like 25 feet high or something. So if you look at Bibi Harnam Kaur's funeral picture, is there internet here? I could just pull it out. If there isn't, it's not a big deal. I'll show you after. But if you look at Bibi Harnam Kaur's funeral picture, behind the huge group picture, there's just a massive fence that's really, really high. And it's so that people wouldn't find out there's cremations happening. If you go to kamagatamarujjourney.ca. And so the thing was, so when they lit the pyre, it would by the time the smoke reached that height, it would dissipate. So no one knew it was going on. I can show you the picture, but we can move to the next question, I think, and I'll find the picture in the meantime. Does that work?
Yeah. All right, guys, this is going to be the last question.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned the first Anand Karaj that happened. I wanted to ask, who was the first Canadian-born Sikh?
This has come full circle. This is beautiful. Okay, I'm going to answer your question. I don't want to lose the gravitas of that question or the gravitas of this moment. So give me a second to pull up this picture and I'll answer the question. Does that sound fair?
No problem.
Okay, I'm having so much fun right now. I go to Vancouver, no one else, they're just like, Paneet's talking again, no big deal. Now this is nice. You guys are all interested in stuff. No one's interested over there. Okay, we're almost there. Right here. So this is Bibi Harnam Kaur's funeral. I'll show you a few things here if you're interested. But you'll notice, first thing, it's also mislabeled. But you see those massive boards? It's all around, and so people wouldn't see the funeral happening. I can also point out a few other things. There's BBG. So this is by Pag Singh right here, and this is by Balwant Singh right here, holding their sons. There's also, if you look over here, this is by Hira Singh's wife, we believe, who's also standing behind by Meva Singh Ji and their funeral. Bibi Kartar Kaur, I believe, is this woman. It's one of these two, actually. I'm doing this quickly, that's why I can't tell, which is by Balwant Singh Ji's wife. Also interesting is, this is by Mancha Singh. This is Annie Wright. And that's Winnie Wright. And she's holding a baby, which is likely Bibi Harnam Kaur's baby. And Noah, like this was an unidentified picture till just a little while ago, just till last year. You can see there's Kirtan happening on the side. This is by Hira Singh, whose wife that is. This is Sorn Lal, I mentioned him before. Both of them were arrested by Meva Singh Ji. And there's a guy over here, Agora, and he guesses who this might be? Hopkinson. Yeah, there you go. Okay. I thought that was pretty cool. Okay. So the first Sikh born in Canada was by Naranjan Singh Atwal. He was the son of Bhai Balwant Singh Ji. He was born in 2nd Avenue, Gurdwara. He lived his whole life in Canada, and he passed away in 1996. Yeah, but it's just nice how it was by Balwant Singh Ji, so like everyone knows the name already, and it's a good place to end. Yeah.
Guys, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So once again, thank you, Paneet Singh, for coming down from BC and sharing your wealth of knowledge with the Sangat.